Macmillan Audio presents Feel Good Productivity. How to do more of what matters to you.
Written and read by me, Ali Abdaal. The figures referenced throughout this audiobook can be downloaded from your audiobook retailer. Introduction. Merry Christmas, Ali. Try not to kill anyone. With these words, my consultant breezily hung up the phone, leaving me to handle an entire ward of patients alone. I was a newly qualified junior doctor, and 3 weeks previously I'd made a rookie error, forgetting to fill out a form to request the holidays off. Now here I was, managing a hospital ward on my own on Christmas Day. Things had started badly and rapidly got worse. When I arrived at the hospital, I was met by an avalanche of patient histories, diagnostic reports, and cryptic scan requests that would have made more sense to a seasoned archaeologist than an on-call radiologist. Within minutes, I was confronted by the day's first emergency, a man in his 50s who had collapsed from a severe cardiac arrest. And then one of the nurses informed me that a patient urgently needed a manual evacuation. If you know, you know. At 10:30 a.m., I looked around the ward. Nurse Janice was sprinting up and down Corridor A in a panic, her arms overflowing with IV drips and medication charts. On Corridor B, a stubborn elderly patient was loudly demanding his misplaced dentures. Corridor C had been taken over by a drunken exile from the emergency department, wandering the corridor and shouting, "Olive! Olive!" I never learned who Olive was. And every minute, somebody was making a new demand. "Dr. Ali, can you check on Mrs. Johnson's fever? Dr. Ali, can you help with Mr. Singh's elevated potassium?" I soon found myself starting to panic. Medical school hadn't prepared me for anything like this. Until then, I'd always been quite an effective student. Whenever the going got tough, my strategy was simple: work harder. It was a method that had got me into medical school 7 years previously. It had allowed me to secure a handful of publications in academic journals. It had even allowed me to launch a business while I studied. Discipline was the only productivity system I knew, and it worked. Except now, it wasn't working. Since starting as a doctor a few months previously, I'd felt like I was drowning. Even when I worked late into the night, I couldn't see the number of patients or finish the paperwork that I needed to. My mood was suffering too. I'd enjoyed my medical training to be a doctor, but I was finding the actual job utterly depressing, constantly worrying that I might make a mistake that would kill someone. I stopped sleeping, friendships faded, my family stopped hearing from me, and I just kept working harder. And now this, Christmas Day, alone on a hospital ward, failing to get through my shift. Everything came to a head when I dropped a tray of medical supplies, sending syringes flying across the linoleum floor. As I forlornly looked down at my damp scrubs, I realized I had to figure things out, or my dream of becoming a surgeon would slip through my fingers. That night, I hung up my stethoscope, grabbed a mince pie, and opened my laptop. I'd once been so productive, I thought. What had I forgotten? During my first year at medical school, I'd become obsessed with the secrets of productivity. I'd stayed up night after night, making notes on hundreds of articles, blog posts, and videos, promising the key to optimal performance. All the gurus emphasized the importance of hard slog. A Muhammad Ali quote came up a lot. "I hated every minute of training, but I said, don't quit, suffer now and live the rest of your life as a champion." As Christmas turned to Boxing Day, I stayed up poring over my old notes and wondered whether that was where I was going wrong. Did I just need to regain my old work ethic? But when I returned to work the next day, resolving to just do more, it made no difference. Even though I stayed on the ward until midnight, and even though I was reciting Muhammad Ali's line to myself during my toilet breaks, I wasn't getting through my paperwork any quicker. My patients were still getting a tired, ineffective version of Ali, and I was still displaying a conspicuous lack of Christmas cheer. At the end of my hardest day yet, I felt completely underwater, and then from nowhere, I remembered some words of wisdom from my old tutor, Dr. Barkley. If the treatment isn't working, question the diagnosis. Slowly, and then all at once, I started to doubt all the productivity advice I'd absorbed. Did success really require suffering? What was success anyway? Was suffering even sustainable? Did it make sense that feeling overwhelmed would be good for getting things done? Did I have to trade my health and happiness for, well, anything? It would take me a few months, but I was stumbling my way to a revelation that everything I'd been told about success was wrong. I couldn't hustle my way to becoming a good doctor. Working harder wasn't going to bring me happiness. And there was another path to fulfillment, one that wasn't lined with constant anxiety, sleepless nights, and a concerning dependence on caffeine. I didn't have all the answers, not by a long shot, but for the first time I could make out the beginnings of an alternative approach. An approach that didn't hinge on exhaustingly hard work, but on understanding what made hard work feel better. An approach that focused on my well-being first and used that well-being to drive my focus and motivation second. An approach I would come to refer to as feel-good productivity. The surprising secrets of feel-good productivity. Back in medical school, my obsession with productivity had led me to tack on an extra year to earn a psychology degree. As I started putting together the pieces of feel-good productivity, I remembered a study I'd been tested on, one that involved a candle, a book of matches, and a box of thumbtacks. Picture yourself with these three objects before you. Your task is to stick the candle to the corkboard on the wall so that, when it's lit, the candle wax won't drip onto the table below. You find yourself puzzling over the items, turning them over in your hands. Can you think of the solution? And here in the supplementary PDF you will find the diagram, but I'll just describe it to you because I know that you might be listening to this while driving or something. Basically, it's a diagram of a candle, 3 matches, and a box of thumbtacks. So when presented with this problem, most people only consider the candle, the matches, and the thumbtacks. But more innovative minds recognize the potential of the thumbtack box. The optimal solution to the puzzle involves viewing the thumbtack box not just as a container, but as a candle holder. And again, in the supplementary PDF, you'll see what this looks like in diagrammatic form. Basically, the box is attached to the wall using the thumbtacks, which are these little pin thingies. The candle is on top of the box, and the matches are underneath. And so the idea is that if the candle drips, the wax goes onto the box rather than onto the floor, thus solving the problem. This is the candle problem, a classic test of creative thinking. First developed by Carl Dunker and published posthumously in 1945, it has since been used in countless studies, testing everything from cognitive flexibility to the psychological fallout of stress. In the late 1970s, psychologist Alice Eisen used it as the basis for an influential experiment to study how mood affects people's creativity. Eisen began by dividing her volunteers into 2 groups. One group was given a small gift, a bag of candy, before facing the candle problem. The other group started the task with no such incentive. The theory went that those who were given the sweets would have a more positive mood when they tried to solve the puzzle. Eisen found something interesting. Those whose moods were subtly improved by the gift were significantly more successful in solving the candle problem. When I first read about Eisen's experiment during my psychology degree, I found it interesting, but not exactly transformative. Personally, I'd never felt the overwhelming urge to stick a candle to a wall. But coming back to it as a junior doctor, I realized that Eisen's insight was quite profound. It suggested that feeling good doesn't just end with feeling good. It actually changes our patterns of thought and behavior. I now learned that the study had become the cornerstone of a wave of research exploring the way positive emotions affect many of our cognitive processes. It showed that when we're in a positive mood, we tend to consider a broader range of actions, be more open to new experiences, and better integrate the information we receive. In other words, feeling good boosts our creativity and our productivity. One of the first people to explore how exactly this works was Barbara Fredrickson. A professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Fredrickson is one of the leading figures in positive psychology, a relatively new branch of psychology that focuses on understanding and promoting happiness. In the late 1990s, Fredrickson proposed what she called the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. According to the broaden and build theory, positive emotions broaden our awareness and build our cognitive and social resources. Broaden refers to the immediate effect of positive emotions. When we're feeling good, our minds open up, we take in more information, and we see more possibilities around us. Consider the candle problem. In a positive mood, participants were able to see a broader range of potential solutions. Build refers to the long-term effects of positive emotions. When we experience positive emotions, we build up a reservoir of mental and emotional resources that can help us in the future. Resources like resilience, creativity, problem-solving skills, social connections, and physical health. Over time, these two processes reinforce each other, creating an upward spiral of positivity, growth, and success. The theory suggests a whole new way of understanding the role of positive emotions in our lives. They're not just fleeting feelings that come and go without consequence. They're integral to our cognitive functioning, our social relationships, and our overall well-being. positive emotions are the fuel that drives the engine of human flourishing. Why feel-good productivity works. When I first started learning about Broaden and Build, I caught a glimpse of a different way of thinking about my life. For years, I thought that by simply hustling harder, I could achieve the things I wanted. If I wanted to be a good doctor, the life ahead of me would be defined by grinding, unrelenting work. Now I could see another way. Fredrickson's theory suggests that positive emotions change the way our brains operate. Step 1 is feeling better. Step 2 is doing more of what matters to us. But why, I wondered. The more I read, the more I realized that the explanations are varied, and in some cases remain unclear. But scientists have started to home in on a few answers. First, feeling good boosts our energy. Most of us have felt an energy that's not strictly physical or biological, one that doesn't come from sugar or carbohydrates, but from a mix of motivation, focus, and inspiration. It's the energy you feel when you're working on a particularly engrossing task, or when you're surrounded by inspiring people. This energy has many different names. It's been labeled as emotional, spiritual, mental, or motivational energy by psychologists. Zest, vitality, or energetic arousal by neuroscientists. But if researchers can't agree on what to name it, they're agreed that it makes us focused, inspired, and motivated to pursue our goals. So what's the source of this mysterious energy? The short answer, feeling good. Positive emotions are bound up with a set of 4 hormones, endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin, which are often labeled as the feel-good hormones. All of them allow us to accomplish more. Endorphins are often released during physical activity, stress, or pain, and bring about feelings of happiness and diminished discomfort, and elevated levels usually correlate with increased energy and motivation. Serotonin is connected to mood regulation, sleep, appetite, and overall feelings of well-being. It underpins our sense of contentment and gives us the energy to tackle tasks efficiently. Dopamine, or the reward hormone, is linked with motivation and pleasure, and its release provides a satisfaction that allows us to focus for longer. And oxytocin, known as the love hormone, is associated with social bonding, trust, and relationship building, which enhances our capacity to connect with others, boosts our mood, and in turn impacts our productivity. All this means that these feel-good hormones are the starting point of a virtuous cycle. When we feel good, we generate energy, which boosts our productivity, and this productivity leads to feelings of achievement, which make us feel good all over again. Second, feeling good reduces our stress. In addition to the Broaden and Build theory, Barbara Fredrickson also developed what psychologists call the undoing hypothesis. Fredrickson and her colleagues were interested in decades of research showing that negative emotions cause the release of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. This isn't a problem in the short term, it's the mechanism that motivates us to run from danger. But if we experience these negative sensations too often, we become riddled with anxiety and our physical health suffers. The continuous activation of these hormones can even increase the risk of developing heart disease and high blood pressure. Not ideal. Fredrickson wondered about the flip side. If negative emotions have these harmful physiological effects, then perhaps positive emotions could reverse them. Might feeling good reset the nervous system and put the body into a more relaxed state? To test this out, Fredrickson came up with a rather mean study. Researchers told a group of people that they had 1 minute to prepare a public speech that would be filmed and judged by their peers. Knowing that the fear of public speaking is practically universal, Fredrickson hypothesized that this would elevate the subject's levels of anxiety and stress. And it did. People reported feeling more anxious and experienced increases in heart rate and blood pressure. Next, the researchers randomly assigned participants to watch one of 4 films, 2 evoking mildly positive emotions, the 3rd neutral ones, and the 4th sad ones. And they then measured how long it took the participants to recover from the stress. Their findings were intriguing. The participants who watched the positive emotion films took significantly less time to return to their baseline state in terms of heart rate and blood pressure. And those who watched the sadness-evoking film took the longest time to return to baseline. This is the undoing hypothesis, that positive emotions can undo the effects of stress and other negative emotions. If stress is the problem, then feeling good might just be the solution. But the final and perhaps most transformative implication of feel-good productivity goes well beyond any one task or project. Because third, feeling good enriches your life. In 2005, a team of psychologists read all the studies they could find on the complex relationship between happiness and success. They delved into 225 published papers, which involved data from over 275,000 individuals. Their question, does success, as we're often told, make us happier, or could it be the other way around? The study offered hard evidence that we tend to get happiness wrong. Individuals who frequently experience positive emotions aren't just more sociable, optimistic, and creative, they also accomplish more. These people bring an infectious energy to their environment, proving more likely to enjoy fulfilling relationships, get higher salaries, and truly shine in their professional lives. Those who cultivate positive emotions at work morph into better problem solvers, planners, creative thinkers, and resilient go-getters. They're less stressed, attract higher evaluations from their superiors, and show a higher degree of loyalty to their organizations. Put simply, success doesn't lead to feeling good leads to success. And we have a diagram in the book here which basically summarizes what we've just said, which is that feeling good, firstly, boosts your energy, secondly, it reduces your stress, and thirdly, it enriches your life. And there are some cute little icons in that diagram, but obviously you're listening to the audiobook, so you can't appreciate the illustrative prowess that went into these, but that's okay. How to use this audiobook. Back in that first harrowing year as a doctor, most of these discoveries were still years ahead of me. I was working endless shifts and trying to shoehorn my productivity research into the fleeting breaks between visiting patients. But even the basic insights I uncovered were enough to cause a dramatic change in my relationship with work. When I started to let go of my obsessions with discipline and focus instead on making work feel good, my horrific shifts started to get easier. Soon, my mood started to improve too. I remember one appointment with an elderly patient a few months after I discovered feel-good productivity. "You know, doctor," she said, "you're the first one in here who has smiled all week." These new perspectives wouldn't just alter my approach to being a doctor, they would alter the direction of my life altogether. For the first time in years, I began to see the opportunities beyond the confines of my work, my friendships, my family, and the other passions that I'd sidelined. And I soon found myself wanting to share my discovery. For a few years, I'd been running a YouTube channel on which I posted study tips and technology reviews. Now I started sharing practical insights that I'd learned from psychology and neuroscience, using myself as the guinea pig, experimenting with everything I learned and the strategies I thought might work. As my radical notion that success doesn't have to be tied to suffering started to gain traction, I started to get more and more emails from my viewers. High school students aced their exams, business owners doubled their income, parents managed to balance work and family life better, all by applying the strategies I was sharing. Even seasoned professionals, worn out from the grind of corporate life, were discovering fresh energy, motivation, and new direction. And so was I. The more I read, the more my philosophy developed. Eventually, by following the same principles and strategies I was learning about, I realized that I wanted to take a break from medicine to pursue something new. That's when I knew I had to write this book. What's contained in this audiobook isn't just another productivity system to help you get more done at any cost. It's about doing more of what matters to you. It'll help you learn more about yourself, what you love, and what really motivates you. My method has 3 parts, each of which tackles a different aspect of feel-good productivity. Part 1 explains how to use the science of feel-good productivity to energize yourself. It introduces the 3 energizers that underpin positive emotions: play, power, and people, and explains how to integrate them into your daily life. Next, Part 2 examines how feel-good productivity can help us overcome procrastination. You'll learn about the 3 blockers that make us feel worse: uncertainty, fear, and inertia, and how to overcome them. When you remove these blockers, you won't just overcome procrastination, you'll feel better too. Finally, in Part 3, we'll explore how feel-good productivity can sustain us in the long term. We'll delve into the 3 different types of burnout: overexertion burnout, depletion burnout, and a misalignment burnout. And I'll explain how we can harness 3 simple sustainers, conserve, recharge, and align, to make us feel better not just for days and weeks, but for months and years. Every chapter contains its fair share of practical tips, but my goal in this book isn't to offer you some sprawling to-do list. It's to offer you a philosophy, a new way of thinking about productivity that you can apply to your own life in your own way. My hope is that you leave this book an amateur productivity scientist, as it were, finding some methods that work, discarding others, and working savvily to see what helps you feel good and achieve more. That's why every chapter contains not only 3 simple, science-backed ideas that you can use to rethink productivity, but also 6 experiments that you can implement in your own life. If an experiment works for you, great. If it doesn't, then that too is a helpful insight. By the end of the book, though, you should have a toolkit for applying feel-good productivity to your own work, relationships, and life. I only hope it works as well for you as it has for me. Because if there's one thing I've learned by immersing myself in the science of feel-good productivity, it's that it applies in every sphere. It turns daunting tasks into engaging challenges. It leads to deeper connections with peers. It drives meaningful interactions in what you do every day. By understanding and applying what makes you feel good, you won't just transform your work, you'll transform your life. Feel-good productivity is a simple method, but it changes everything. It shows that if you've ever felt underwater, you don't have to settle for staying afloat. You can learn how to swim. Let's dive in. Part 1. Energize. Chapter 1. Play. On paper, everything about Professor Richard Feynman's career looked perfect. Aged just 27, he was already being hailed as one of the greatest physicists of his generation, the man most likely to work out how to harness the potential of nuclear energy. Now he'd been appointed one of the youngest professors at Cornell University in upstate New York. There was just one problem. He was bored of physics. The issue had started in the mid-1940s. Every time he sat down to think, he just felt tired. It had begun when Feynman's wife, Arlene, died of tuberculosis in June 1945, months before the end of World War II in America. After her death, all the music in the young professor's life faded away. The ideas that had so animated him as a doctoral student felt dull and flat. Even though he was good at teaching, it felt like a bore and a chore. I had simply burned myself out, he later recalled. I'd go over to the library a lot and read through the Arabian Nights, he wrote. But when it came time to do some research, I couldn't get to work. I was not interested. It was pretty easy doing nothing, he found. He still liked teaching undergraduates, sitting in the library reading and wandering around campus. He just didn't like working. Easy enough. By the late 1940s, Feynman had reconciled himself to a new identity, a physics professor who didn't do any physics. Until, one day, everything changed. A few years after his problem started, Feynman was sitting in the university cafeteria, alone opposite a group of students. One of them was repeatedly throwing a plate up in the air. Feynman noticed something odd. While the plate was airborne, it wobbled, but the Cornell logo inscribed on the plate seemed to wobble faster than the plate itself. Curious, Feynman thought, but not exactly Nobel Prize-worthy. He was the man who had helped crack the code of nuclear fission. He wasn't supposed to be theorizing the characteristics of airborne crockery. But this moment of curiosity sparked a minor epiphany. He began to reflect on what had drawn him to his subject in the first place. I used to enjoy doing physics, he later recollected. Why did I enjoy it? I used to play with it. I used to do whatever I felt like doing. It didn't have to do with whether it was important for the development of nuclear physics, but whether it was interesting and amusing for me to play with. After leaving the cafeteria, Feynman found himself reminiscing about how he'd seen the world as a teenager. When he was in high school, the things that had most fascinated him about the world had seemed mundane to others. He would see water growing narrower the further it got from the tap, and wonder if he could figure out what determined that curve. I didn't have to do it. It wasn't important for the future of science. Somebody else had already done it, he said. That didn't make any difference. I'd invent things and play with things for my own entertainment. What if returning to that worldview held the key to finding joy in physics again, he wondered. Approaching physics not as a job, but as a game to be played for fun? I got this new attitude, he decided. Just like I read the Arabian Nights for pleasure, I'm going to play with physics whenever I want to without worrying about any importance whatsoever. It started with that wobbling plate. In the weeks that followed, Feynman spent weeks trying to model the equations that explained how the plate moved through the air. His colleagues, bemused, asked him why. There's no importance whatsoever, Feynman told them blithely. I'm just doing it for the fun of it. But the more Feynman got into the wobbling plates, the more fascinating they became. Soon he was pondering whether the wobbling of a rotating plate was anything like the wobbling of electrons in an atom, or maybe the workings of quantum electrodynamics. He said, before I knew it, it was a very short time, I was playing, working really, with the same old problem I loved so much. Except this time, the work of physics didn't burn him out. Professor Feynman's interest in plate spinning would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in physics. His model for all that wobbling helped make sense of quantum electrodynamics, a theory that describes how light and tiny particles interact at the quantum level. To visualize them, he said, it's helpful to imagine rapidly spinning plates. Feynman was not alone. To my knowledge, at least 6 Nobel Prize winners attribute their success to play. James Watson and Francis Crick, who discovered the structure of DNA in the 1950s, described the generative process they used to come up with the structure as, quote, constructing a set of molecular models and beginning to play. Alexander Fleming, the scientist who discovered the antibiotic penicillin, once described his job as, quote, playing with microbes. Donna Strickland, the 2018 Nobel laureate in physics, described her career as, quote, getting to play with high-intensity lasers. Konstantin Novoselov, who shared the 2010 Nobel Prize in Physics for helping discover graphene, put it most simply. If you try to win the Nobel, you won't, he reflected. The way we were working really was quite playful. This approach is supported by a growing body of research. Psychologists increasingly believe that play holds the key to true productivity, partly because it provides a sense of psychological relief. As one recent study put it, the psychological function of play is to restore the physically and mentally fatigued individual through participation in activity which is pleasurable and relaxing. Play is our first energizer. Life is stressful. Play makes it fun. If we can integrate the spirit of play into our lives, we'll feel better and do more too. Key idea number 1, create an adventure. Bringing play into our lives is easier said than done, you might say. In adulthood, many of us are all too aware that play doesn't come easy. When we're kids, our days are filled with a sense of adventure. We explore every inch of the garden, we race through shopping malls, we climb trees, and we swing from branches. We're not striving for goals or trying to boost our resume. We're following our curiosity and enjoying activities without worrying about results. But as we get older, this spirit of adventure gets slowly squeezed out of us. Unless you had particularly forward-thinking parents, you were probably taught that the first major step towards becoming a grown-up is to stop playing and start taking life seriously. Life goes from being filled with adventure to a mundane, predictable existence. This is a mistake, because adventure, it turns out, is the first major ingredient of play, and perhaps of happiness as well. In one 2020 experiment from New York University and the University of Miami, scientists attempted to quantify the effects of approaching the world with a sense of adventure. They enlisted over 130 participants and got their consent to track their location using the GPS in their phones. Over the next several months, the researchers sent the participants text messages asking them about their emotions. How happy, excited, or relaxed did they feel? The results were eye-opening. As the GPS data and responses to the text messages rolled in, it became clear that those who had more adventurous experiences, those who took themselves off to a wider and more random assortment of places, whether taking a new route to work or trying a different coffee shop rather than sticking to their regular one, felt happier, more excited, and more relaxed. Their conclusion? An adventurous life holds the key to unlocking positive emotions. So the first way to harness the potential of play is to integrate adventure into our lives. But how? Well, with the right tools, we can still find the excitement we once got from racing through those malls and swinging from those branches. The first step, choosing your character. Experiment number 1, choose your character. Confession, I used to be addicted to World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft is an online role-playing game that's famously aimed at total nerds. You start by choosing your character. It could be a warlock, a warrior, a paladin, or plenty more, and explore the fantasy world of Azeroth. You team up with other players to fly around the world, slaying demons, upgrading your weapons, and having the time of your life. It's also famous for being highly addictive. In the 3 years after I discovered the game when I was 14, I clocked up 184 days of playtime on it. That's 4,416 hours. 3 hours a day, or 25% of my waking hours. It was a lot. Why did I find World of Warcraft so addictive? As a 14-year-old, there's nothing more exciting than killing monsters and going on quests. Actually, as an adult, that still sounds pretty appealing. But if this simple fact explains why the first few hours of gameplay are fun, it probably doesn't explain the next several thousand. To be honest, after a while, the mechanics of the game stop being that entertaining. There are only so many times you can enjoy being sent on a mission to rescue the local village's cat. I increasingly suspect it wasn't the basic mechanics of World of Warcraft that made it so pleasurable, it was the escapism. The game offers a vivid, alternative world, one where you can slay an army of zombies with a magic spell, or tame a dragon and fly around on its back. And more importantly, it's a world that you enter in character. In World of Warcraft, I've never been Ali Abdaal, the slightly nerdy school kid with zero sporting ability and confidence issues. I've always been Sephiroth, the tall, handsome, blood elf warlock with billowing purple robes and an army of demons at my command. Play allows us to take on different roles or personas, whether we're becoming a character in World of Warcraft or acting out an imaginary scene with friends in the playground. These characters allow us to express different aspects of ourselves and transform our experiences into something more enjoyable. When you take on a different persona, you start to find adventure. This is not as out there as it sounds. Choosing your character doesn't mean reinventing your personality overnight, nor pretending to be a goblin in front of your colleagues. Rather, it means identifying the type of play that most resonates with who you are, so you can choose a type of player to embody. Dr. Stuart Brown has spent most of his career studying the psychology of play. A clinical psychologist, he began researching the benefits of play after witnessing its transformative effects on patients. Eventually, he would establish the National Institute for Play and become a clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego. During this time, he spoke to over 5,000 people from all walks of life, ranging from artists to truck drivers to Nobel laureates, about what play meant to them. In the course of these interviews, he discovered that most of us are prone to just one or two particular types of character play. By finding the ones that resonate with us the most, we can start to take on a, quote, play personality that frees up our sense of adventure. These are the 8 play personalities that Dr. Brown distilled through his research. 1. The collector. The collector loves to gather and organize, enjoying activities like searching for rare plants or rummaging around in archives or garage sales. Number 2. The competitor. The competitor enjoys games and sports and takes pleasure in trying their best and winning. Number 3. The explorer. The explorer likes to wander, discovering new places and things they've never seen through hiking, road tripping, and other adventures. Number 4. The creator. The creator finds joy in making things and can spend hours every day drawing, painting, making music, gardening, and more. Number 5. The storyteller. The storyteller has an active imagination and uses their imagination to entertain others. They're drawn to activities like writing, dance, theatre, and role-playing games. Number 6. The joker. The joker endeavors to make people laugh and may play by performing stand-up, doing improv, or just pulling a lot of pranks to make you smile. Number 7. The director. The director likes to plan, organize, and lead others and can fit into many different roles and activities, from directing stage performances to running a company to working in political or social advocacy. And number 8. The kinesthete. The kinesthete finds play in physical activities like acrobatics, gymnastics, and free running. So here lies the first step to approaching your work and your life with a sense of playful adventure. Reflect on which of these characters you identify with most, and try to approach your work as if you are that character. If you're the storyteller, that might entail seeking out ways to turn a boring task, like writing a dry logistical email, into one that draws on your sense of playfulness, like finding a way to turn it into a story with a beginning, middle, and end, and maybe an unexpected twist. Or if you're the creator, it might mean transforming mundane tasks, like filling in that dull spreadsheet, into opportunities for self-expression, like turning it into a visually appealing and easy-to-understand infographic, for example. Identifying and exploring our play personalities helps us reclaim some of the adventure that defined our childhoods, a time when feeling good was the norm, not the exception. It's a spirit that still lies within us. As Stuart Brown says, remembering what play is all about and making it part of our daily lives are probably the most important factors in being a fulfilled human being. Experiment number 2, embrace your curiosity. What does the term dinosaur actually mean? What Beatles song stayed in the US singles charts for the longest? Who was the president of the United States when Uncle Sam first got his beard? These are not just questions from a particularly fiendish pub quiz. They're 3 of the 19 prompts used by researchers at the University of California Davis Center for Neuroscience in a pioneering experiment. After asking a group of 24 volunteers these questions, they asked each of them to rate how much they cared about the answers to each question, from low curiosity to high curiosity. And then they let the questions simmer in the minds of the participants for a while. The answers, by the way, are Terrible Lizard, Hey Jude, and Abraham Lincoln. The researchers were trying to investigate what effect curiosity had on people's minds. For one thing, the researchers had a hunch that when people were curious about something, they remembered the details better. They were right. The study showed that people were a whopping 30% more likely to recall a fact that they found interesting rather than a fact that they found boring. But what was perhaps more surprising was what was going on in people's brains at the point that they recalled these facts. When they were given a brain scan, their neurological activity was quite different when they were asked a question that they were curious about. They seemed to receive a hit of dopamine. Dopamine is one of our feel-good hormones, and it also activates the part of the brain responsible for learning and forming memories. So for the study participants, engaging with their curiosity made them feel good, and they, in turn, became better at retaining information. Harnessing your curiosity is a second method for building adventure into your life. Curiosity doesn't simply make our lives more enjoyable, it also allows us to focus longer. After painstakingly researching the biographies of some of history's most pioneering minds, from Leonardo da Vinci to Steve Jobs, the writer Walter Isaacson summarized his findings thus. Being curious about everything not only makes you more creative, it enriches your life. How then do we integrate a sense of curiosity into our lives? Well, one method is to seek out what I call side quests. In video games like Zelda, The Witcher, and Elden Ring, there are dozens of side quests waiting to be pursued. These side quests don't affect the main story of the game, but are driven by the curiosity of the player. What happens if I enter this cave, or try to get to the highest point in this area, or swim to the bottom of this lake? Many of the game's best secrets may be hidden in caves and forests and villages that a player following the basic storyline wouldn't otherwise come across. I often think of my life as containing a series of side quests. Every day, as I sit down to work, I look at my calendar and to-do list, and I ask myself, what's today's side quest going to be? This question helps me shift my mindset from the obvious tasks that lie ahead to the potential alternative avenues they might take me down. It might prompt me to leave my office and spend a few hours working in a local coffee shop, or it might encourage me to explore new software that I could use to solve the problem I'm working on. By adding a side quest to your day, you create space for curiosity, exploration, and playfulness, and could discover something amazing and totally unexpected along the way. Key idea number 2, find the fun. It was a starlit evening in the late 1990s at a small university in Ohio. A young graduate research assistant stood in the lab holding a rat in his palm. He delicately stroked the rat's white belly with a dry paintbrush, hoping that something interesting would happen. At first, nothing. But then, suddenly, the rat cried out. Except not in distress. If anything, the rat seemed to be laughing. These scientists weren't tickling rats just for the fun of it. In fact, they were investigating the biological effects of play on the human brain, what lead scientist Jaak Panksepp called the biology of joy. At the time, the prevailing belief in the scientific community was that only humans experienced emotions. It was thought that emotions stem from the highly complex part of the brain that is unique to us, the cerebral cortex. But Panksepp's discovery that rodents could laugh suggested an alternative, that emotions must come from much more primitive areas of the brain, like the amygdala and the hypothalamus. Joy, Panksepp showed, is a deeply primal experience. One of Panksepp's key findings was that rats love to play. He spent much of his experiment recording the sounds made by rats when they were playing. The noises were joyful, he later said. It sounded like a playground. The reason? Play releases dopamine. It made the rats feel good. We can learn a thing or two from these rodents. Panksepp's rats showed that if we want to find joy in what we're doing, it won't be solely down to the higher and most complicated parts of the brain, those associated with the cerebral cortex. It's also down to the more ancient, basic parts of our neurology, the same feel-good hormones activated in those rats. We too can release little dopamine hits that keep us happy and engaged. But how? The answer can be found by studying what specifically elicits dopamine. As one article published by Harvard Medical School puts it, the hormone is activated by, quote, sex, shopping, and smelling cookies baking in the oven. In other words, by the activities we find fun. So, if we want to harness the revolutionary effects of play, our second step is to seek out fun everywhere we go. And that starts by paying a visit to a Disney-fied version of Edwardian London. Experiment number 3, the magic post-it note. During a particularly exhausting phase working as a junior doctor, my housemate Molly and I decided to revisit a childhood favorite, Mary Poppins. We hoped that immersing ourselves in a world of animated birds, extremely bad Cockney accents, and musical hits about suffragism would provide some relief, even if only for a couple of hours. At the time, I was struggling to find motivation to study for my postgraduate medical exams. When combined with my hospital work, the looming deadlines and complex material felt overwhelming. The idea of sitting down to read textbooks at the end of my shift felt nightmarish. But as I rewatched Mary Poppins, something unexpected happened. The movie wasn't just a frivolous tale of a quirky nanny with magical powers, it held a profound truth. One of the film's most famous songs is A Spoonful of Sugar, which Mary sings to the children when they're complaining about chores. I didn't remember many of the lyrics from my childhood, other than the chorus. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down in the most delightful way. And I wanted to sing that line, but we can't for copyright reasons. Watching this familiar yet forgotten scene 20-something years later, I heard how the song begins. In every job that must be done, there is an element of fun. You find the fun and snap, the job's a game. The rest of the song describes various ways in which larks, robins, and honeybees make their tedious tasks more enjoyable by singing while they work. Robins apparently sing their merry tune in order to move the job along, an analysis I was subsequently sad to learn is not ornithologically accurate. I decided to apply this idea to my own life. In a late-night burst of inspiration, I grabbed a Sharpie and a Post-it note and wrote 9 simple words. What would this look like if it were fun? I stuck the note to my computer monitor and went to sleep. By the time I spotted the note on my monitor the following day, I'd forgotten that I'd put it there. I'd just got back from work and was making a start on relearning some biochemistry pathways for my medical exam. I sat down with my usual grin and bear it expression, but when I saw the Post-it, it got me thinking, what would this look like if it were fun? The first answer came to me immediately. If this were fun, there would be music. I realized that memorizing tedious biochemistry pathways magically became a lot more interesting with the Lord of the Rings soundtrack playing through my headphones. Suddenly, music became one of the most important ways for me to bring more playfulness into my work. I also began to apply this method at work. At the time, I was on my geriatric medicine placement, where the doctor's office was a small, scantily decorated room in the corner of the ward. On one particularly grueling afternoon, when I was sitting in the office with an enormous list of tasks before me, I decided to apply the musical fun method. I didn't have any speakers with me, so I grabbed a bowl from the kitchen and put my phone in there to use as a makeshift speaker. I opened up Spotify and spent the rest of the day doing my tasks with the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack playing at a low volume. The effects were transformative. It just felt better. What would this look like if it were fun has now become a guiding question of my life, and it's surprisingly easy to draw upon. Think of a task that you don't want to do right now, and ask, what would it look like if it were fun? Could you do it in a different way? Could you add music or a sense of humor or get creative? What if you set out to do the task with friends or promised yourself a treat at the end of the process? Is there a way to make this draining process a little more enjoyable? Experiment number 4. Enjoy the process, not the outcome. There's another way to find fun in everything you're doing, and it doesn't even involve rewatching children's films from the mid-20th century. In fact, it's best demonstrated by a 5'7" Spanish teenager with bleached blonde hair. In August 2021, Alberto Gines Lopez stepped onto the podium as the inaugural gold medal winner in sport climbing at the Summer Olympics in Tokyo. Over the preceding weeks, the world had watched transfixed as he completed a series of astonishing physical feats on the multicolored walls of Tokyo's Aomi Urban Sports Park. Most impressive of all was the speed climbing, where you clamber up a wall as fast as possible, spider style. Lopez reached the top of the wall in a dazzling 6.42 seconds. But as the crowds watched Lopez and his fellow climbers scramble up the walls at dizzying speeds, they also noticed that this was quite an unusual sport. It wasn't just that the competitors tended to look rather more bohemian than your regular track and field athletes with locks of colorfully dyed hair and brightly colored harnesses. They also seemed to be more relaxed. Rather than avoiding eye contact and watching tensely as their competitors took to the walls, many of the climbers seemed to be chatting jovially at the bottom and even sharing tips. When they did take to the walls, their faces displayed none of the agonized intensity that most sprinters or even footballers tend to exhibit. In fact, they seemed to be positively enjoying themselves. Those climbers hint at our second way to find the fun, by emphasizing the joy that comes not from the outcome, but the process itself. According to the Hungarian-American psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the biggest difference between climbing and, say, football is that most climbers are completely immersed in the process, climbing the wall, rather than the end result, winning the game. The pioneer of the study of flow, that state in which we're so immersed in a task that the rest of the world seems to melt away, Csikszentmihalyi first developed his theories while watching climbers in the Alps as a teenager. Csikszentmihalyi argued that if we can learn to focus on the process rather than the outcome, we're substantially more likely to enjoy a task. But how? It might be easy enough for rock climbing, which is inherently fun, to some anyway, but what if you find yourself in altogether more mundane or even unpleasant situations? Arguably, this is where the power of focusing on the process becomes even more powerful. Because with a little creative thinking, you can find joy in any process, however mundane it might seem. Take the story of Matthew Dix, today a world champion storyteller and best-selling novelist. Years before he published his first book, Dix worked in McDonald's, and he hated it. The days felt endless, Matt once told me. It was the same routine over and over again, taking orders, flipping burgers, and handing out fries. There was no excitement, no spark, no challenge. And so Dix decided to see if there was any joy to be had, not in the job's outcome, his infuriatingly meager paycheck, but in the process instead. He landed on a classic tactic, upselling. Some days I'd decide it was barbecue sauce day, he recalls. So for the rest of the day, I'd add a mini sales pitch to each order I took. The customer would order a Big Mac and fries, and I'd ask them if they'd like any sauce with that. If they said no, I'd smile and say, well, I'd really recommend the barbecue sauce. There's nothing that beats that. Usually at this point, they were a little taken aback, and they'd say, okay then, I'll take the sauce. If they still didn't bite, I'd say, that's okay, but you're really missing out. My last customer was reluctant, but when she tried the sauce, she knew she'd made the right decision. Dix says that the effects of these little changes in his routine were unexpectedly significant. They were the kind of mini tasks that might, in his words, just make the customer's day a little better and definitely made me feel more energized on days that felt like they were dragging. And they worked. Dix found himself looking forward to his shifts, eager to see how many people he could convince to try the barbecue sauce. The process was not inherently enjoyable, but Dix had created a way to enjoy it, and in doing so, he had found the fun in an uninspiring situation. And key idea number 3, lower the stakes. If adventure and fun promote our ability to play, there's a related, similarly potent factor that reduces that ability: stress. To understand how, let's turn once again to this chapter's most unfortunate experimental subjects, white rats. Alas, these rats were in for a less enjoyable afternoon than their brush-tickled counterparts that we met earlier. On this occasion, scientists from Columbia University took a group of rats at various different stages of development and placed a mesh on top of each one so that it was restrained and couldn't move freely. Then they left them there for 30 minutes. Unsurprisingly, this proved pretty stressful. Before being restrained by the mesh, the rats were messing around with each other, play fighting and touching each other's napes. But after the mesh was released, the researchers found that the rats' play behavior completely disappeared. Instead, the rats stayed huddled in groups, not playing at all. Thankfully, the play behavior returned to baseline levels an hour after this stressful, restraining experience. Studies on humans, though blessedly less nasty than the ones on animals, have found similar results. Children are more likely to play when they're in a comfortable, non-threatening environment, and studies of adults in the workplace have found that the feeling of relaxation promotes playful behaviors, as well as promoting creativity and well-being. These studies and countless others prove something that most of us instinctively know to be true. When we're stressed, we're less likely to be playful. And our creativity, productivity, and well-being tend to suffer too. All this hints at our final ingredient of play. For play to flourish, we don't just need to seek out adventure and find fun. We also need to try and create an environment that's low stakes and that fosters relaxation. And we can start to do that by reappraising how we think about failure. Experiment number 5, reframe your failure. In 2016, a NASA-trained engineer named Mark Rober recruited 50,000 people to try out a new computer challenge. He wanted to prove that anyone could learn how to code, he told them, and so he set them off on a series of relatively easy coding challenges. In fact, the experiment was more complicated than Rober let on. The key difference came when the participants made an error. Half of them, Group 1, received an error message when they wrote code that failed to execute properly. You have failed, please try again. The other half, Group 2, got a slightly different message. You have failed. You've lost 5 points. You now have 195 points. Please try again. Everything else about the two groups was identical. This small distinction made an astonishing difference. Group 1, on average, made 12 attempts to solve the coding puzzle and had a success rate of 68%. Group 2, on average, made just 5 attempts to solve the puzzle with a success rate of 52%. The first time I heard about this experiment, I was astonished. Purely because there was an arbitrary, meaningless penalty of 5 points for failure at the puzzle, the 25,000 people in Group 2 from all around the world made, on average, less than half the number of attempts at the puzzle than those in Group 1. As you might have guessed, Rober's interest wasn't really in teaching people to code. He was most interested in how we think about failure. His aim was to show that we're hugely, disproportionately impacted by negative consequences, even arbitrary ones, and these consequences make us afraid of failure even when we needn't be. But what if there was a different way to look at failures? One that allows us to see them as inevitable and maybe even fun. This is what Rober was trying to work out. Having worked at NASA for 9 years, then at Apple as a project designer, before switching his focus to becoming a science educator on YouTube, Rober's experiment proved what he'd already noticed in the world of work, that success isn't down to how often you fail, it's about how you frame your failures. In a talk where he shared the findings of this experiment, Rober asks, if we could just frame our learning process so that we weren't so concerned with failure, how much more could we learn? How much more could we succeed? Rober knew that getting a computer program to work invariably requires a process of trying, failing, and trying again. These supposed failures are not really failures, they're data points that we need to figure out how to succeed. In the course of writing this book, I've often felt moved by Rober's insight, because his study offers a useful insight into how to reduce stress, and in turn, how to create an environment where you can play. Imagine what your life would look like if you received 5 proverbial points for failing rather than losing 5 like in the experiment. Imagine what would happen if people cheered you on for a little stumble rather than humiliated you. Imagine how you'd approach things if you treated them as experiments where failure would be just as valuable as success. Might you now see the game of life slightly differently? Suddenly the stakes are lower, and suddenly you can afford to play around a little. If your goal is to find a fulfilling career and your hypothesis is that a corporate role might be fulfilling, then your data collection process might be to sample careers through internships and job placements. With an experimental mindset, an internship that you end up hating wouldn't be a failure or a waste of time. It would be just another data point to help you realize that that's not what you want. If your goal is to build a successful business, then your data collection process might involve testing different business ideas, products, or services. With an experimental mindset, a product launch that doesn't meet expectations wouldn't be a failure or a disaster. It would be just another data point to help you refine your strategy and better understand your target market. And if your goal is to develop meaningful relationships, then your data collection process might involve going on dates, attending social events, and engaging with new people. With an experimental mindset, a date that doesn't lead to a second one, or a friendship that doesn't blossom, wouldn't be a failure. It would just be another data point to help you understand your compatibility. No failure is ever just a failure. It's an invitation to try something new. And finally, experiment number 6, don't be serious, be sincere. Once we've reframed our failures as data points, it becomes easier to eliminate the stresses that stop us approaching life with a sense of play. But there's a final method that's just as powerful, one that I learned from the world's unlikeliest Buddhist guru. Born in Chislehurst, Kent, an unremarkable suburban district of southern England, for the first few years of Alan Watts's life, he seemed destined to become a bank clerk or maybe a lawyer. He developed an interest in East Asian religion after experiencing a mystical fever dream as a child. It would change his life. Over the next 50 years, he became a leading authority on Eastern philosophy, publishing multiple best-selling books on what Zen and Taoism can teach us about the universe. When I first stumbled upon Watts's lectures a few months into writing this book, I was immediately struck by the profundity of his way of seeing the world and how well that perspective fitted into my theories of feel-good productivity, and in particular, a simple phrase for which he would become famous: don't be serious, be sincere. In one famous lecture, The Individual in the World, Watts outlined a key mistake we make in understanding the world. He quotes the early 20th century English writer G.K. Chesterton: "In frivolity there is a lightness which can rise, but in seriousness is a gravity that falls like a stone." This, he said, was true of people who understood Zen. He summarized it thus: there is a difference between being serious and being sincere. What did he mean? Well, consider playing a board game, Monopoly, let's say. No one wants to play Monopoly with someone who takes the game too seriously. We've all played those games. The serious person cares a little too much about winning, and they suck the energy out of the room. Their obsessive quoting from the rulebook regarding whether you're really allowed to collect £200 for passing go via a chance card gets in the way of everyone else's fun. But neither do we want to play a game with someone who's completely uncaring. These people don't engage with the game and don't make an active effort to play to the best of their ability. They don't congratulate you when you manage to get out of jail, even though you refused to pay the £50 exit fee and instead went for the bold, daring strategy of rolling a double. They're no fun either. No, the most fun people to play games with are the people who play sincerely. They take the game seriously enough to be fully engaged in the experience, but not so seriously that they become fixated on winning or losing. They're able to laugh and joke around, to make light of their mistakes, and to enjoy the company of their friends without becoming overly attached to winning or the rules. There's a lot to be gained from treating our work and our life with this approach too. I find that in moments when I feel stressed, anxious, or drained by my work, it's easy to forget to be sincere and to flip towards being too serious instead. In these moments, the stakes feel overwhelming, but there's a way to lower them. The trick is simple. When you feel like your work is draining or overwhelming, try asking yourself, how can I approach this with a little less seriousness and a little more sincerity? If you are approaching a difficult project at work sincerely rather than seriously, you might focus on the process of completing each task rather than becoming fixated on the end result. You might also seek out the input and collaboration of others rather than trying to tackle the project on your own. By doing these things, you may find that it's easier to approach it in the spirit of play and that you're better able to stay focused and motivated throughout. If you were approaching a job interview sincerely rather than seriously, then instead of becoming overly nervous and stressed about the outcome, you might focus on being present and engaged. You might also try to connect with the interviewer on a more personal level, rather than simply trying to impress them with your credentials. By doing so, you might be more likely to approach the interview with lightness and ease, and to come away from the interview feeling more confident and satisfied with your performance. And if you were approaching writing a book sincerely rather than seriously, you might decide to throw a detailed homage to World of Warcraft into the very first chapter, illustrating to your future readers that even when creating something as significant as your first book, you can treat the process with levity. By doing so, you'd hopefully help the text create a sense of fun, even while holding forth on the science of productivity. You might end up able to stress less and play more. I'm not the only doctor to think so. In the medical drama Grey's Anatomy, Dr. Derek Shepherd, the handsome neurosurgeon played by Patrick Dempsey, has a ritual at the start of each of his operations. He greets the team, puts some energizing music on in the background, and says, "It's a beautiful day to save lives. Let's have some fun." In summary, seriousness is overrated. If you want to achieve more without ruining your life, the first step is to approach your work with a sense of play. There are 3 ways you can incorporate the spirit of play into your life. First, approach things with a sense of adventure. When you step into the right play personality, every day abounds with opportunities to see life as a game filled with surprises and side quests. Second, find the fun. Remember Mary Poppins, there's an element of fun in every task, even if it isn't always obvious. Try asking yourself, what would this look like if it were fun, and then build your projects around the answer. Third, lower the stakes. Failures are only failures when you think they are, and not every problem needs to be approached with such a straight face. So what would it mean to approach your work with less seriousness and more sincerity? Chapter 2. Power. In September 2000, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph attempted to sell their fledgling company, Netflix, to the CEO of Blockbuster Video. It went extremely badly. The pair had bet on what they thought was a revolutionary model for video rentals. Customers would log into a website, order DVDs, and receive and return them through the post. But while they'd poured everything they had into the company, they were hemorrhaging cash. They had over 100 employees, but only 3,000 paying customers, and they were on track to lose $57 million before the year was through. They wanted out. So after months of calling and emailing, they finally secured a meeting with Blockbuster's boss, John Antioco, at the company's headquarters in Dallas. It was a big opportunity, a $6 billion publicly traded company with over 9,000 stores worldwide. Blockbuster dominated the American video market. But the meeting went dramatically off the rails. At first, Antioco and his general counsel, Ed Stead, were friendly and polite. They listened carefully as Hastings and Randolph explained why Blockbuster should buy Netflix, a new type of video rental for an online world. But then Antioco asked the big question. How much? $50 million. There was a moment's silence, and then Antioco burst out laughing. Fast forward 10 years, and Blockbuster Video had filed for bankruptcy. Unable to keep up with the pace of the transition to online video, the company had gradually closed the majority of its stores before finally going bust. Fast forward another 10 years, and Netflix, by then an online streaming service, was valued at a market cap of $300 billion and universally hailed as one of the world's most innovative companies. The transformation of Netflix from a company that was literally laughed out of the room by Blockbuster's CEO to one of the most valuable businesses on earth seemed unlikely. How did they do it? Well, there are a few answers. Some credit the vision of Hastings and his team, others their fortuitous timing and launching just as the internet took off. But the most common explanation for Netflix's success is more simple: culture. As Netflix was first getting off the ground, Reed Hastings hired Patty McCord as Netflix's chief talent officer. McCord had previously worked in human resources at a few other tech companies, and she wasn't happy with the traditional approach to people management. She wanted to create a culture where employees felt able to take control of their own work. Hastings worked with McCord to create a set of values that would guide the company's culture, including a focus on freedom and responsibility. This subtle shift was transformative. McCord spearheaded a radical shift in the way Netflix approached its staff. She got rid of traditional policies like vacation days and set work hours and performance reviews, and gave more autonomy to employees. As long as employees met their goals, they could do whatever they liked. This approach was met with some skepticism at first, but as the company grew and flourished, it became clear that it was working. Netflix's culture not only helped the company attract and retain top talent, but also led to better ideas. Rather than relying on traditional methods of market research and focus groups, Netflix let their creative teams take the lead in developing and producing new shows and movies. The result was some of the most remarkable TV and film of our time. McCord summarized her focus on freedom and responsibility in a simple word: power. It's a tricky term, and one that can have negative connotations, conjuring up images of totalitarian dictators, horrible bosses, and shadowy hallways, where people do whatever they can to grab and hold on to control over others. Some might see the word power and think, that's not me. If you're one of those people, I want you to start thinking differently about power. When McCord used the word, she meant a sense of personal empowerment, the sense that your job is in your control, your life is in your hands, and that decisions about your future are yours alone. This power isn't something that we exert on others, it's something we feel, the energy that makes us want to shout from the rooftops, I can do it. Power is our second energizer, a crucial ingredient in feeling good and being productive. And best of all, it's not something you seize from others, it's something you create for yourself. Key idea number 1, boost your confidence. Our journey into the science of power begins in a lab filled with several dozen exercise-averse volunteers. This group of 28 female students had been brought together precisely because they did not exercise particularly often, a fact that some scientists at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign thought presented a research opportunity. In their study, published in the International Journal of Behavioral Medicine, they set out to test a simple hypothesis, that our confidence in our athletic abilities has a huge impact on what those abilities actually are. At the beginning of the experiment, all 28 students were asked to cycle on a stationary bike for a fixed amount of time, while a device measured their heart rate and VO2 max, the amount of oxygen your body can absorb and use during exercise. Once the exercise session was over, the researchers split the students into 2 groups based on their performance on the exercise bike. After a brief cool-down period, they told students in Group A, the high-confidence group, that relative to other women of their age and experience, they were among the fittest. The students in Group B, the low-confidence group, meanwhile, were told that they were among the least fit. And then both groups of women were left to stew for a few days. The truth was, the whole thing was a ruse. The high-confidence group wasn't actually better at exercise, and the low-confidence group wasn't actually worse. In fact, they'd been randomly allocated into the 2 groups, and their performance on the exercise test had nothing to do with the message that was delivered. What the scientists were really interested in was the next stage. 3 days later, the participants were asked to come back to the lab to exercise for about 30 minutes and asked to rate how much they enjoyed this new session. The results were striking. The researchers found that those in the high-confidence group, who had been told how very fit they were, enjoyed the exercise session a lot more than the low-confidence group, who had been told that they were unhealthy. This was even truer for exercise that was more intensive and challenging. When the participants were asked to cycle harder and for longer, the difference between the 2 groups became even more stark. When the going got tough, those who believed they could do it, regardless of their ability, were the ones who actually could. And crucially, the students who were primed to be more confident ended up enjoying the exercise a lot more too. This study was exploring a simple question: how does our level of self-confidence affect our performance? The answer to this question, along with those of many such studies before and since, is simple: a great deal. Feeling confident about our ability to complete a task makes us feel good when we're doing it and helps us do it better. The origins of this insight can be traced back to the Canadian-American psychologist Albert Bandura. Born in the tiny town of Mundare, Alberta in 1925, by the time of his death in 2021, Bandura was one of the most influential psychologists in history. That influence was, in large part, down to an idea that he introduced in 1977 and one that would make him famous: self-efficacy. Drawing on his research over the previous decade, Bandura argued that it's not just our abilities that are important in human performance and well-being, it's how we feel about our abilities. Self-efficacy was the term he coined to describe such feelings, referring to how much belief we have that we're able to achieve our objectives. To oversimplify just a little, self-efficacy is psychology jargon for confidence, and taking steps to boost it is the primary way we can build our sense of empowerment. In the half-century since Bandura introduced the concept of self-efficacy, hundreds of researchers have shown that the higher our confidence in our own abilities, the higher our self-efficacy, the greater those abilities become. By 1998, psychologists Alexander Stajkovic and Fred Luthans were able to state, on the basis of 114 studies involving almost 22,000 study participants, that Bandura was right. Believing you can is the first step to making sure you actually can. Experiment number 1, the confidence switch. The idea of self-efficacy is intriguing, but maybe not that surprising. Of course our levels of self-confidence affect our abilities, you might think. Anyone who's ever seen an egotist charm their way around a room, thanks solely to an unwavering faith in their own brilliance, can attest to that. But what's more surprising about self-efficacy, perhaps, is quite how malleable it is. Because from the moment Bandura began investigating the science of confidence, he noticed something else striking: that self-efficacy is easy to teach. After decades of research, he concluded that confidence isn't something you're born with, it's something you learn. In the years after he introduced his revolutionary idea, Bandura would go on to identify a few simple tools that can have a transformative impact on self-efficacy. Take the power of verbal persuasion. Bandura was fond of pointing out a simple truth about self-efficacy, that the things you say often become the things you believe. As such, the very act of hearing small positive interventions like, "you can do it," or "nearly there," can have a remarkable effect on our self-confidence levels. Usually, we imagine that the source of these uplifting phrases will be our family, friends, colleagues, or personal trainers. But what's more intriguing is that we can also deliver these messages to ourselves. In 2014, scientists at Bangor University published results from a study into the power of self-talk. Each participant was tested on their time to exhaustion, that is, how long they could cycle for before they felt unable to go on. Then, like our previous group of exhausted cyclists, they were left to ruminate for 2 weeks. This time, however, the second stage was different. When they returned to the bikes after a fortnight, they were divided into 2 groups. One got a positive self-talk intervention, where they were shown a series of motivational phrases like, "you're doing well," and "you can push through this," and chose 4 of them to tell themselves while cycling. The other group got no such prompt. Surely, such tiny acts of self-motivation couldn't single-handedly transform the participants' performance, the scientists thought, except it turned out they could. The group that got the specific self-talk intervention ended up significantly reducing their RPE, their rate of perceived exertion, or how effortful the cycling felt at the 50% mark, and noticeably improving their TTE, their time to exhaustion, when cycling. The other group performed exactly the same as they had previously. This study shows that simply by becoming your own hype team, you can dramatically impact your own productivity. In the years since I read it, I've come up with a few specific ways you can do so too. My favorite method involves what I call flipping the confidence switch. In other words, challenging yourself to behave as if you're confident in your task, even if you're not. The method is even more simple than it sounds. The next time you're not feeling good enough to take a chance, simply ask yourself, what would it look like if I were really confident at this? What would it look like if I approached this task feeling confident that I could do it? I used to use this trick extensively when I worked as a walk-around magician at balls and parties at university. Yes, I was that cool. My job would be to dress up in a tuxedo, go up to groups of partygoers, and offer to show them a few magic tricks. Even though I'd practiced my tricks ad nauseum, just ask any of my friends, I'd still be absolutely terrified at the idea of approaching a group of strangers, interrupting their conversation, and stumbling over my words as I offered to show them my favorite card trick. In those moments of self-doubt, I'd take a deep breath and internally flip the confidence switch. I'd remind myself that I was just playing the part of a confident magician, and even if I didn't feel at all confident internally, I was going to act as if I were both confident and competent. Without fail, the shift in my attitude made a huge difference. I'd walk up to groups of strangers with a smile and a slight swagger, my lines well rehearsed, and I'd come away from each group feeling relieved that the strategy had actually worked. I've often surprised myself at quite how impactful this method can be. Just for a moment, it's enough to turn an amateur magician into a professional, a terrible amateur musician into a guitar hero, and a nervous public speaker into the most charismatic orator. Next time you're feeling like a task or project is particularly difficult, ask yourself, what would it look like if I were really confident at this? Just by asking yourself the question, you'll visualize yourself confidently approaching the task at hand. The switch has been flipped. Experiment number 2, the social model method. Verbal persuasion wasn't the only method Bandura came up with for boosting self-confidence. He was also interested in the way we get confidence from the people around us. My favorite study showing how this works comes from the Clemson University Outdoor Lab. This is not your ordinary science laboratory, mind. Nestled on a wooded peninsula by Lake Hartwell in South Carolina, the lab boasts a series of wooden cabins, hiking trails, and water sports equipment, with not a petri dish in sight. But the recreational veneer of the lab hides its serious scientific function. Over the years, the laboratory has been the site of many pioneering psychological experiments, like the 2007 study of 38 children aged 6 to 18 who were invited to use the university's climbing wall. When they first arrived at the lab, the students were told that their objective for the day was to make it to the top of the rock climbing wall, one of the main features of Clemson's outdoor lab. It was a daunting prospect. Most of them had never even seen a climbing wall before. The scientists who were running the study were interested in which students would complete the task and what might make them more likely to do so. Unbeknown to the children, they'd been split into 2 groups before their arrival. Group 1 had been shown a short video of someone climbing up a wall that looked very similar to the one at the location, while Group 2 hadn't been shown any videos at all. In every other way, the groups were identical. Amazingly, just watching that video had a dramatic effect. Even though both groups of climbers were given the same instructions when they first arrived at the wall, the group that watched the model rock climber ascend the wall that they were about to tackle ended up doing a lot better. They felt more confident about their rock climbing abilities, enjoyed the activity more, and performed better. Why did this small change make such a big difference? If Albert Bandura were to comment, he'd probably attribute it to something called the vicarious mastery experience. This is when you witness or hear about someone else's performance related to a task you're going to undertake yourself. You see other people's examples, and it boosts your confidence. Most of us have experienced vicarious mastery, even if we didn't have the words for it. Picture this. You're struggling with a big research project at work. You're the only person working on the task, and it feels daunting. After a few days of alarming unproductivity, you start to conclude that it's not only hard, it's impossible. As you get more and more convinced that what you're attempting is completely unachievable, you get further and further off target. Now imagine the same task, except this time, before starting the project, you saw someone else present their research project on a similar theme. The content of their presentation is entirely different to yours, but this time you know that this kind of task isn't impossible, you've just seen someone else pull it off. You've become more confident that the task can be mastered vicariously. Bandura argued that being surrounded by other people who show persistence and effort in overcoming challenges can increase our own feelings of self-efficacy because they demonstrate to us that these challenges can be overcome. In the words of Bandura, seeing people similar to oneself succeed by sustained effort raises observers' beliefs that they too possess the capabilities to master comparable activities to succeed. Like positive self-talk, we can integrate these vicarious mastery experiences into our own lives. My favorite way is by consuming different forms of content created by my role models. I've found that my sense of confidence increases substantially when I read books, listen to podcasts, or watch videos with stories of people succeeding in the areas in which I want to feel more empowered. For example, while working in hospital, I'd often listen to the RCP Medicine podcast produced by the Royal College of Physicians on the way to work. Hearing about how different doctors approach different diagnoses and management would give me a boost of confidence that would carry over into my job. When I was building my first online business, I spent a lot of time listening to the Indie Hackers podcast, which featured interviews with entrepreneurs who'd built incredible one-person online businesses from their bedrooms. They talked about the challenges they'd faced and how they'd overcome them, which boosted my own confidence when it came to dealing with similar challenges. And in my new life as a writer, I find that watching, listening to, and even conducting interviews with successful authors does more to boost my own feelings of I can do this than almost anything else. It's a toolkit anyone can draw upon. Find people who are going through the same challenges as you and spend time with them, or find other ways to hear their stories. By immersing yourself in vicarious success, you'll be building a powerful story in your own mind that if they can, you can too. Key idea number 2, level up your skills. Anakin Skywalker begins his journey as an 8-year-old on Tatooine who races drones to try and make enough money to feed his family. Over the next 3 installments of Star Wars, he learns to use the Force, trains with a lightsaber, and grows into one of the most powerful Jedi in the galaxy. Katniss Everdeen begins her journey as a 16-year-old from District 12, where she hunts illegally to provide for her mother and younger sister. After she volunteers to compete in the deadly Hunger Games, we see her becoming a skilled archer and strategist, forming unexpected alliances and leading a rebellion against the oppressive capital. Despite the odds always being against her, she becomes a symbol of hope and resistance to the whole nation, the fabled Mockingjay. And in a personal favourite, Avatar: The Last Airbender, our protagonist Aang starts off as a kid from a small village, struggling to control his powers over the element of air. Through the series, he explores the world. We see him eventually growing into the powerful Avatar, with mastery over all 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. At the end of the series, he even saves the world from destruction in an epic showdown with the Fire Lord Ozai. These 3 narrative arcs, among thousands of others in stories and tales across millennia, illustrate a way that we can boost our sense of power. Each main character begins their story as a young, inexperienced apprentice. Over time, we watch, read, or hear as they overcome challenging obstacles and grow as people, each one of their successes contributing to the next, and the next, and the next. Our friend Albert Bandura has a catchy name for the way these learning experiences compound: inactive mastery experiences. Inactive mastery is the flip side of the vicarious mastery we've just encountered. According to Bandura, an inactive mastery experience refers to the process of learning through doing. Learning through doing is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. It's the second key strategy if we're to build our sense of power. Why? Because the more we do something, the greater our sense of control. We learn, we level up our skills, our confidence grows, and we empower ourselves. Experiment number 3, the Shoshin approach. What's most interesting about these learning experiences is that they can be built into your life with relative ease. Even in areas where you feel like you're making no progress whatsoever, you can harness the potential of inactive mastery. I learned my favorite way to do so from the story of Phil Jackson. Most basketball fans will know a little about Jackson already. They might know he was the coach who transformed the culture of the Chicago Bulls in the 1980s. They might know about how, as head coach, he led his team to so many NBA championships in the 1990s that it started to get a little embarrassing. 6, if you're interested. Or they might know that it was Jackson, more than any other coach, who helped turn Michael Jordan into a legend. What they tend not to know, however, is the unlikely origin of Jackson's sporting philosophy, Zen Buddhism. Zen is a branch of Buddhism that emphasizes the practice of meditation as a means to spiritual enlightenment. Zen encourages individuals to look inward and discover their own path to understanding the nature of reality. It was, according to Jackson, integral to every success he ever had. One Zen concept that came up time and again in Jackson's coaching practices was the Japanese word Shoshin, which roughly translates as beginner's mind. Shoshin refers to a state of mind in which we approach every task and situation with the curiosity, openness, and humility of a beginner. It might sound odd that adopting a beginner's mind helps you become more of an expert in that field. Surely a beginner is someone who, by definition, has no idea what they're doing. However, Shoshin can have a remarkable impact precisely because it allows us to see things afresh. Think about a skill you've spent years learning. You probably have a set way of doing it. If you like to draw, you know which part of a portrait you prefer to start first. If you play sport, you probably decided long ago which position on the pitch best suits your talents. Your experiences have made you much more set in your ways than you once were. A beginner, on the other hand, has none of these preconceptions. A beginner is more willing to try things out, even if they might fail. A beginner will start with whatever part of somebody's portrait tickles their fancy. And a beginner is happy to start off playing anywhere on the field, even if they might make a fool of themselves. They're more willing to make mistakes, and these mistakes are precisely what's needed to learn. When we try to see the world with a fresh perspective, we can maintain this learning process long after it would usually stop. To the Chicago Bulls, this meant approaching each moment with an open mind, free of bias towards any set path or strategy. And according to Jackson, this was the foundation of his team's success. So how can we integrate this beginner's outlook into our lives? The answer starts with giving yourself some simple reminders. If you're in the world of business, Shoshin might mean embracing innovation and experimentation, reminding yourself that masters become limited by their beliefs in what's been done and how, while beginners seek new approaches to problem solving and explore new markets or opportunities. Or if you work in creative fields like writing or music, Shoshin might mean deliberately maintaining your interest in different techniques and pushing yourself to collaborate with people with different styles. Beginners don't hold strong beliefs about what will work, they just try. By letting go of the idea that we know everything, or somehow should, we actually feel more powerful. In this way, Shoshin can help us approach challenges with a greater sense of curiosity, humility, and resilience, and help us to learn. Experiment number 4, the protégé effect. While studying for my psychology degree, I was pleased to learn that older siblings tend to have, on average, slightly higher IQs than their younger siblings. I'd long wondered why I found my little brother so annoying when we were kids. Now I knew. Scientists have tried to come up with various explanations for this phenomenon over the years. Could it be that parents tend to invest more time and energy into their firstborn children than their siblings? Could it be that firstborn children are more likely to engage with adults, which helps develop their vocabularies? Or could it be that parents are more likely to have higher expectations from their first child than from any subsequent children, which nudges firstborns to try harder in school? The jury's still out, but one interesting explanation stems from a study carried out by researchers at Stanford School of Education in 2009. The researchers brought 62 eighth graders into a biology class, where they were randomly assigned to one of two groups. The first group was told to study and learn the material as they normally would, with the goal of performing well on a test at the end of the class. The second group was told that they would be teaching the material to a computer-generated avatar, and that their performance would be evaluated based on how well their digital student learned the material. At the end of the class, both groups took the same test to assess their mastery of the material. Strangely, the researchers found that the students in the second group, who taught the material to a computer-generated student, learned better than the students in the first group, who studied for the test alone. In identical circumstances, with identical material, the people who had to teach others about a subject would learn the material better themselves. The researchers named this phenomenon the protégé effect. In the years since, researchers in the field of human intelligence have suggested that perhaps older siblings, on average, have higher IQs and perform better in school than their younger counterparts because of this very phenomenon. Older siblings take on the role of teacher or mentor to their siblings. Older siblings, like me, often help their younger siblings, like my brother, with their homework, answer their questions about the world, and share their own experiences and insights, however dubious. The protégé effect hints at another way we can boost the number of learning experiences in our lives. As the philosopher Seneca said, qui docet discit, he who teaches, learns. And once you understand the power of the protégé effect, it becomes surprisingly easy to take on the role of teacher in almost any role. Say you work in software development, you might offer to mentor a junior developer or intern. By explaining complex coding concepts and best practices to someone else, you'll be forced to think more deeply about them yourself, leading to a deeper understanding and improved skill level. Or say you work in sales, you might offer to train new sales reps or host workshops for your team. By sharing your techniques and strategies with others, you'll be able to refine your own skills and gain new insights into the sales process. And you'll also be helping to develop the skills of your colleagues, which will ultimately benefit the entire team. And if you're concerned that you're not qualified enough to teach someone else, it's worth remembering that the people we learn from best are often the ones who are just a step ahead of us in the journey, so anyone can become a teacher. You don't need to be a guru, you can just be a guide. And finally, key idea number 3 for this chapter, take ownership of your work. Starting in the early 1970s, the psychologist Edward Deci became intrigued by a simple question: what motivates people to do hard things? This was a theme that had fascinated him since the very beginning of his career. Just 1 year after completing his PhD at Carnegie Mellon University in 1970, he published an influential paper in which he asked people to solve a puzzle called the Soma Cube, a little like a Rubik's Cube. He found that those who were offered a financial reward for solving the puzzle were, weirdly, less likely to enjoy the task and were more likely to give up solving the puzzle after the reward was removed, compared to those who weren't offered any money at all. The material reward seemed to make people less engaged with the task, not more. This led DC to conclude that the offer of a material reward can, peculiarly, decrease motivation. When, in 1977, DC met another young psychologist, Richard Ryan, the pair embarked on a professional relationship that would transform how the world thinks about motivation. Over the next 20 years, Ryan and DC developed a completely new way to think about why we do hard things. Their contribution culminated in 1981 with their statement of self-determination theory. Until that point, most scientists had thought that motivation was mainly driven by incentives like rewards and punishments, but DC and Ryan showed otherwise. They encouraged readers to see motivation falling on a spectrum, with extrinsic at one end and intrinsic at the other. Intrinsic motivation comes from the inside, driven by self-fulfillment, curiosity, and a genuine desire to learn. Extrinsic motivation comes from the outside, driven by pay rises, material rewards, and social approval. But these forms of motivation were not equal. According to self-determination theory, intrinsic motivation is substantially more powerful than extrinsic motivation. Lasting motivation comes from within. But that wasn't where DC and Ryan's theory ended, because they also showed that intrinsic motivation is something that can be built up. As early as the 1980s, they were demonstrating that intrinsic motivation can be enhanced by a handful of forces. Chief among them our sense of autonomy. In layperson's terms, that's a sense of ownership, and it's our final contributor to the sense of power that energizes us and our work. DC and Ryan argued that when people feel they have power over their own actions, they're much more likely to be intrinsically motivated to engage in them. That's why the Soma Cube experiment found that monetary rewards reduce people's motivation. They don't feel like they fully own the task, but that they're undertaking it for some external reward. Their sense of control declines, and so does their sense of motivation. This rings true in our own lives. Our need for control is why we hate being micromanaged by our bosses and our parents. Our need for control is why we love to decorate our bedrooms when we're kids, or design our homes as adults. And when our control over our lives is taken away, if we end up in prison or shackled to a job we don't enjoy, it can have disastrous consequences for our physical and mental health. The trouble is that taking control isn't always straightforward. Sure, some of us have jobs in which we have plenty of ownership over our day-to-day lives. Successful entrepreneurs have autonomy over the direction of their businesses. Digital nomads are free to trot around the globe, working from any cafe they come across. Others don't and can't. A hotel receptionist has to stand at the desk to greet and welcome guests. He can't just choose to work from home. A junior doctor on the hospital ward has to see all the patients on the list. She can't just decide to ignore patients who are rude to her. But what makes the concept of ownership so powerful is that you can integrate it into almost any situation. All too often, when we find ourselves in a situation we don't like, we start feeling fatalistic. I don't like where I live, but it's not in my power to move. I don't like where this relationship is going, but it's not in my power to alter it. I find this work boring, but it's not in my power to change it. Sometimes we're right, there is nothing we can do. But often, we have more agency than we realize. If not over the whole situation, then over parts of it. We have control even when we don't know it. Experiment number 5, own the process. My favorite example of humans' remarkable ability to take ownership of bad situations comes from Fillet of Fish 1066. In June 2016, the gentleman behind the Reddit account, Fillet of Fish 1066, made headlines for getting fired. He'd been working as a software developer at his company for 6 years, where his work mostly involved testing software in the quality assurance department. It was deeply boring. All he did was run the same old tests on the same old software, following the same old scripts every time. So Fillet of Fish 1066 came up with a plan. Without alerting his boss, he spent the first 8 months of his employment programming software to automate his job. From then on, the custom programs he'd written worked on autopilot, running the quality assurance tests perfectly. His boss never checked on him because everything was going well. As he wrote in a post on Reddit after being fired, "From around 6 years ago up until now, I have done nothing at work. I am not joking. For 40 hours each week, I go to work, play League of Legends in my office, browse Reddit, and do whatever I feel like. In the past 6 years, I have maybe done 50 hours of real work, so basically nothing, and nobody really cared." Unfortunately for Fillet of Fish 1066, over half a decade into his ingenious plan, someone at IT figured out what was going on and reported it to his boss. He was sacked for having the audacity to automate his own job. I'm not suggesting that Fillet of Fish 1066 was someone with an impeccable career strategy, nor that he was a paragon of virtue. But I do suspect that Filet-O-Fish 1066's actions hint at the first way we can build our sense of ownership, even in situations in which we have little independence. When we can't take ownership of the situation, we can still take ownership of the process. Filet-O-Fish 1066 had realized that he might not have ownership over what he did, as he had to do what his boss said, but he chose to take ownership over how he did it. There were plenty of things he didn't have any influence over: the software he was testing, the priorities of his manager, the amount of work he was given. But there were plenty of tasks that were entirely in his hands: how he got through that to-do list, how he managed his time, how he made use of the tools that he was given. That was how he realized that his job could be automated, and came to spend 8 months building the systems and processes to do just that. There's a lesson here for us all. There's almost always a way for us to own the process of a task, even when the outcome has been determined by someone else. If you work in customer service, you may not have control over the company's policies, but you can take ownership of how you interact with customers. You can make an effort to listen to their concerns, empathize with their frustrations, and find creative solutions to their problems. If you're a teacher, you may not have control over the curriculum, but you can take ownership of how you teach the material. You can find innovative ways to engage your students, create fun activities that reinforce the concepts, and give personalized feedback that helps each student improve. And if you work in a factory or on an assembly line, you may not have control over the production goals, but you can take ownership over how you contribute to the process. You can find ways to streamline your tasks, identify potential quality issues before they become problems, and offer suggestions for process improvements. There's an extraordinary power to be gained by doing it your way, even in the most disempowering circumstances. And finally, we come to experiment number 6, own your mindset. The final way to build our sense of intrinsic motivation is one that I developed while working as a junior doctor. I first encountered it towards the end of a long shift in the obstetrics and gynecology ward. Just as I was preparing to leave, one of the nurses stopped me and asked, "Dr. Ali, please can you put this intravenous IV line into the lady in bed 4? My heart sank. I knew the patient's veins would be tough to find, and trying to put this line in her was going to delay my leaving the hospital for at least another half hour. As I gathered the equipment, I felt an undercurrent of resentment. If I'd just left a few minutes earlier, it would have been the night doctor's job to put the line in. I could have been driving home, picking up a McDonald's on the way, listening to an audiobook. Now I had to stay behind and sort this annoying task out. But then I overheard a patient in another bay talking to her husband. She was gushing about how wonderful her experience of hospital had been and how grateful she was for the doctors and nurses looking after her. It made me pause. I was about to use my medical training and practical skills to put in an IV line so that we could give a young lady, 12 weeks pregnant with her first child, fluids overnight to help with her nausea. It was going to make her feel much better, and it was going to help the baby growing inside her as well. How could I possibly be grumbling about this? This was the job I'd chosen. I'd been through 8 years of medical training to get to the point where I could be helpful to a patient suffering in front of me. And now that I was finally given the chance to really make a difference, I was complaining about an extra few minutes of work. I couldn't choose whether or not to put in the IV drip, I realized, but I could change my mindset. I recalled an idea I'd first encountered in an interview with the writer Seth Godin. Wandering around with a frown and thinking, why do I have to do this, was a decision. And I could decide to think about it another way. I choose to do this, I could tell myself. I get to do this. Or even, I'm blessed to do this. With this mindset shift from have to choose to, I walked into the patient's bay with a spring in my step and a smile on my face, ready to help insert the line. I'm not the first person to have drawn upon this method. In 2021, a group of academics crafted an ingenious set of studies designed to test whether the mere idea of owning one's actions could affect their perceptions and behaviors. Half the participants were randomly assigned to a group where they were asked to write about 3 choices they'd made the previous day. For example, I chose to wake up early yesterday. I chose to eat instant noodles for lunch. I chose to wake up on my second alarm and move on with my day. The other half of the participants were instead asked to just write about 3 things they did the previous day. I ate breakfast. I went shopping. I went to the gym. Once both groups had done the writing task, they were asked to reflect on their lives more broadly. In one part of the study, the participants were asked to rate themselves in terms of physical strength, answering questions like, how muscular are you, how physically strong are you, and how well built are you on a 5-point scale. The ones who remembered their choices subsequently rated themselves as significantly more muscular, strong, and well built compared to the control group. As the authors put it, increasing the salience of choice led to a sense of self-inflation, a sense of being positively different, bigger and stronger than others. Simply switching their mindset from have to choose to, they boosted their sense of control, power, and in turn, what they were capable of. You can do the same. Have to is coercive language that makes you feel powerless. Choose to is autonomy-affirming language that makes you feel powerful. Whenever you feel you must do something, think again. How did your choices lead you to this moment? And is there a way to turn this have to into a choose to? And if you're doing something you really didn't choose, what choices can you make around your approach? Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp during World War II, put it beautifully. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. In summary, power is a scary word, but it doesn't have to be. When we say that the second energizer is power, we don't mean exerting control over others. Here, we simply mean feeling empowered to take your job, your life, and your future into your own hands. There are 3 ways you can increase your sense of power starting now. Begin with confidence. We think our confidence is fixed, but actually it's extremely malleable. So why not try flipping the confidence switch and playing the role of someone who's already filled with self-belief? Next, level up your skills. Ask yourself, if I were completely new to this task, what would this look like? And how can I start teaching others even though I'm not an expert yet? Finally, see what you can do to take ownership, even in moments when you don't have as much control as you'd like. Remember, if you can't choose what you work on, you can still choose how you work on it. The outcome isn't always in your hands, but the process, and certainly your mindset, often is. Chapter 3. People. Have you ever noticed that after hanging out or working with certain people, you feel like you're ready to take on the world? These are the people who uplift your spirits and fill you with energy. You want to be around them. On the other hand, you've also probably come across people who leave you feeling drained and exhausted after every interaction. It's as if they cast a shadow over your mood and motivation. People learn to avoid them like the plague, and they learn fast. A friend of mine refers to the latter group as energy vampires. They suck the lifeblood out of a social situation, leaving everybody in the vicinity exhausted. When I first heard the term energy vampire, I thought it was a bit too harsh and a bit too fantastical, but she had a point. Scientists have long been aware of what they call relational energy, the fact that our interactions with others can have a profound effect on our mood. In a study in 2003, psychology professors Rob Cross, Wayne Baker, and Andrew Parker came up with the concept of an energy map. They worked with consultants and managers in a few giant firms to establish who worked with whom and the impact that any given person had on other people's energy levels. Their discovery, that there was a remarkable amount of agreement about who was an energizer and who was a drainer, even at the level of large organizations. Some people are just a total nightmare to be around. In the years since, relational energy has become one of the buzziest concepts in organizational science. Defined as the positive feeling and sense of increased resourcefulness experienced as a direct result of an interaction with someone else, relational energy was the subject of only 8 studies in 2010, but by 2018 the number was closer to 80. So relational energy provides us with our final energizer, people. As that 2003 study showed, people can enhance our mood and make us more productive. But this isn't a given. It requires deep thought about how we connect with each other. In this chapter, we'll explore various ways we can surround ourselves with people to feel more energized and to do more of the things that matter. Key idea number 1, find your scene. Our first insight into the feel-good effects of people comes from the world of 1970s glam rock. It was the beginning of a new decade, and Brian Eno looked to be on his way to a life of contented mediocrity. A recent graduate of the Winchester School of Art, he had been involved in a few avant-garde music projects in recent years, drumming in the odd art rock band and recording the odd song on his battered tape recorder, but nothing had quite taken off. He seemed set for a life as a well-liked but peripheral player in London's rock world. And then, one day in 1971, a chance encounter with a local musician changed everything. Eno was waiting for his train when he bumped into an acquaintance, the saxophonist Andy Mackay, who invited him to a local club where he was playing. When they arrived at the gig, the atmosphere was electric. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, and the energy in the room gripped Eno. Later, he would say of the chance meeting with Mackay, If I'd walked 10 yards further on the platform, or missed that train, or been in the next carriage, I probably would have been an art teacher now. Instead, Eno found himself in the midst of a vibrant and exciting music scene. In the weeks that followed, he talked to the people he met about music, and found himself producing the best art of his life. With Mackay, he would found the influential glam rock band Roxy Music, and eventually become one of the most significant musicians and producers of the last century. Years later, Eno would reflect on the importance of that unique musical community in launching his career. He noticed that all the most innovative and groundbreaking musicians of his time were not working in isolation. They were part of a larger scene of artists, producers, and fans who were all pushing each other to explore new sounds and ideas. Eno had discovered the genius of the collective scene, or, as he called it, scenius. I've experienced the effects of scenius firsthand. One thing I didn't like about medical school was the sense of competition. Everyone was trying to get the highest grade, the academic prize, the best slot in the residency program. Some took this competitive mindset a little far. One guy I knew would take out multiple copies of the same textbook from the library so that others couldn't use it. Such environments encourage people to see their lives as a zero-sum game. For them to win, others have to lose. But there's another way to think about your relationship with your peers, I eventually learned. Medical school wasn't a competition. We were all part of the same scene. By understanding that fact, we were able to access a wealth of support that we would never have alone. Experiment number 1, the comrade mindset. How can we build this sense of scenius into our day-to-day lives? The answer begins with a subtle shift, reappraising what we mean by teamwork. When someone says the word teamwork, we tend to imagine a set of behaviors, splitting up work fairly, or maybe helping someone out when they get stuck. That's part of it, certainly. But there's another way of understanding teamwork, less as something to do and more as a way of thinking. This is the suggestion of Stanford professors Gregory Walton and Priyanka Carr, anyway. They've argued that teamwork is as much a psychological state as a way of dividing up tasks. In a study published in 2014, they divided 35 participants into groups of 3 to 5. After the experimentees had met and introduced themselves, they were taken into individual rooms. The scientists then gave each participant a puzzle and told them they could take as much or as little time to solve it as they needed. After working on their puzzles for several minutes, all the participants received a handwritten tip on how to solve them. All the tips were the same and were genuinely helpful. But there was one crucial difference. When some participants were given the tip, they were told it had been written for them by the scientist running the study. Others were told it had been written for them by one of the fellow participants who they'd met earlier. This small difference had a significant impact on how the participants felt about the experiment. Those who were told that the tip was from the scientists were more likely to feel like they were working completely separately from the participants they met. When asked to describe what they did in the study, some replied, "I did an individual puzzle while other people did the same puzzle." They were working in parallel, not together. In contrast, people who were told that the tip was from a fellow student were more likely to feel as if they were on a team with the others. They felt like they were, quote, trying to collaborate with an invisible partner to solve the problem by sending each other tips. When asked how they felt during the study, some participants wrote, "I would feel obligated to work hard on the puzzle so as not to disappoint other people." They were no longer working in parallel, they were working together. This subtle change of mindset had a remarkable effect. Participants in the Together group ended up working on the puzzle for 48% longer. They had developed what I call a comrade mindset, and they were doing better as a result. This subtle difference between working in parallel and working together might seem small, but it hints at the first tool we can use to harness the energizing effects of people. Even if we're on our own in undertaking a task, we can convince ourselves that we're part of a team, and do so with remarkable ease. The trick is to deliberately think about the people you're working alongside as part of your team. What would it take to move your focus from a competitor mindset more towards a comrade mindset? So instead of thinking, you win, I lose, you might think, you win, I win. Instead of thinking of my success, you might think of our success. And instead of thinking, I rise by outdoing others, you might think, we rise by lifting others. What would it look like if the people you worked with weren't competitors, but comrades instead? If you're an employee, could you recruit people to work with you and rely on each other for moral support? If you're a student, can you share your notes or find ways to revise in groups? As Walton concluded, simply feeling as if you're part of a team of people working on a task makes people more motivated as they take on challenges. When the going gets tough, it's better to have friends to lean on than enemies to lord it over. Experiment number 2. Find synchronicity. There are moments when it can be difficult to find people to collaborate with, of course. Sometimes it can be hard to force yourself to think about people working on the other side of the campus, let alone world, as part of the same team. Sometimes our peers can simply be rather annoying. In these moments, we can draw upon a second tool, one I first came across via a confoundingly clever study by 3 academics at Ryerson University in Canada. In a 2017 paper, these academics brought together a group of 100 students to investigate the science of teamwork. After being divided into groups of 6, the students were given headphones and asked to tap their hand on the table to a musical beat. Some groups of 6 were briefly all given the same musical beat, so they were tapping in synchrony. In other groups of 6, 2 subgroups of 3 were given the same music to tap to. Finally, some people were given 6 completely different soundtracks, so there was no synchrony at all. After that, the headphones were taken away and replaced by some new props. Each participant was now given 10 tokens to dole out, which they were told would be converted into real money later. Who did they want to give them to? What the scientists were interested in testing was the sense of camaraderie between the participants who were in sync. And they found that the level of musical synchronicity changed everything. When participants spent time tapping fingers in synchrony with the trio, they wanted to dole out money to the trio. But if 2 of these trios tapped in sync, forming a group of 6 for a few minutes, the members were more likely to donate to all 6. What does any of this have to do with the feel-good effects of other people? Well, it tells us something powerful about how to create a sense of teamwork. When we work in synchrony with other people, we tend to be more productive. Synchronicity makes us want to help others, and it makes us want to help ourselves. The implications are simple. If we want to harness the feel-good effects of people, try to find people with whom to work in sync, even if you aren't actively collaborating on the same task. In the course of writing this book, I often attended the London Writers' Salon, which runs a free, remote co-working group called Writers' Hour. Every weekday, 4 times a day, a few hundred writers and some non-writers assemble on a Zoom video call. The facilitator spends 5 minutes sharing a motivational message and asking participants to post in the online chat what their intention for their writing session is going to be. Then, for 50 minutes, everyone minimizes their Zoom window and works away at their computer. I continue to find these sync sessions incredibly helpful for staying energized. Even though we're all working on different things, working in tandem with others has huge effects on my ability to focus and helps me feel better too. Key idea number 2, feel the helper's high. I noticed something else in those virtual writing sessions. With time, I got to know the other people in my group. Soon, we'd start messaging each other for support on Zoom. And that would eventually lead me to another dimension of relational energy, the effect of giving and receiving help. It's an effect that Alan Lux understands better than anyone. As the head of Big Brothers Big Sisters of New York City, Lux was responsible for a network of thousands of volunteers and staff members who were dedicated to improving the lives of young people in New York City. The work could be difficult and often upsetting. The organization matched adult mentors with children and teenagers who were often in the throes of huge family crises, ranging from imprisonment to addiction to suicide. Lux was passionate about the importance of mentorship and the impact it could have on young people. But it was tough. And yet, as his months at Big Brothers Big Sisters turned to years, Lux started to notice something odd. Yes, the volunteers were sometimes left exhausted or upset by what they experienced, but more often they left even the trickiest mentoring sessions highly energized. Lux began to realize that the act of giving could transform not only the lives of the people being helped, but also the lives of the volunteers themselves. Intrigued by this phenomenon, over the next few years he interviewed thousands of volunteers who had experience helping others. They all said they chose to do this work because, in part, it made them feel great. He found that 95% of the volunteers reported feeling happier, more fulfilled, and more energized as a result of their service. Why might that be? Lux's research showed that when we help others, our brains release a flood of chemicals that create a natural high. Feel-good hormones like oxytocin surge through our bodies, creating a wave of positive energy that can last for hours, even days, after the helping has ended. Lux realized that the helper's high wasn't just a feeling. It was a powerful tool for growth, social change, and I would add feel-good productivity. It's the second way we can use the feel-good effects of other people to do more of what matters to us. Experiment number 3, random acts of kindness. When I worked as a doctor, whenever I had a few spare minutes between seeing patients, I'd get up to make myself a cup of tea. On one level, this was a selfish act. I am arguably Britain's leading tea connoisseur. But I also had half an eye on the wider team. On my way to the kitchen, I'd poke my head into the nurse's office and ask if anyone would like me to make them a cup too. This tiny act seemed to have a weirdly significant effect on team morale. I vividly remember offering Julie, one of the senior nurses, a cup of tea at the height of the COVID pandemic. She looked like I'd just offered her a winning lottery ticket. All for a lowly tea bag, some hot water, and a splash of milk, crucially in that order. These random acts of kindness offer the first way to integrate the helper's high into our day-to-day lives. By stopping what you're doing and offering help to people at random, you can boost your endorphin levels and help yourself work harder. Tea is not the only such act of kindness, of course. You can integrate kindnesses into every day, whatever your situation. Say you work in an office. Have you noticed that someone around you looks bored or a little burned out? Why not take them out for lunch instead of having a sandwich at your desk? Or perhaps you're in a supermarket and someone behind you looks stressed. Maybe they have young children. Why not let them go in front of you in the queue? Or say someone has done you an act of kindness, even a little one. They've taken a task that was on your to-do list at a busy time. Why not write them a personalized thank you note? There are any number of these random acts of kindness. Making a colleague a drink, writing a friend a thank you note, offering a stranger your place in line. All subtle, but all subtly transformative too. Experiment number 4, ask for help from others. The helper's high also shows us that asking for help from others can actually be a gift to them rather than the burden we usually assume it will be. This was an epiphany experienced by the young Benjamin Franklin, the polymathic founding father of the United States, who, over his 84-year life, would philosophize on the nature of statecraft, found Philadelphia's first fire department, and signed the U.S. Declaration of Independence. In 1737, though, that was all far ahead of him. Franklin was running for re-election in the Pennsylvania Assembly. A rival legislator was saying some unfavorable things about him. He had completely opposing views to Franklin, and they had a strained, often frosty relationship. Franklin desperately needed to stop this man's propaganda campaign against him. It was at risk of blowing up his bid for re-election. But how could he win over someone who didn't agree with him on anything? The answer, he explained in his autobiography, involved borrowing a book. Having heard that he had in his library a certain very scarce and curious book, I wrote a note to him, expressing my desire of perusing that book and requesting he would do me the favor of lending it to me for a few days, Franklin wrote. To Franklin's surprise, his nemesis sent it immediately. When Franklin returned the book, he included a note expressing how much he enjoyed it. Surprisingly, this had a profound impact on their relationship. When we next met in the house, he spoke to me, which he had never done before, and with great civility, Franklin wrote. And he ever after manifested a readiness to serve me on all occasions so that we became great friends and our friendship continued to his death. This seemingly small act, borrowing a book, had a significant effect on Franklin's opponent and on Franklin himself. The man was so surprised by the gesture that he began to see Franklin in a new light. He couldn't reconcile the fact that he had helped someone he disagreed with. As a result, the man's attitude towards Franklin began to change for the better. This concept is today known as the Benjamin Franklin effect. It suggests that when we ask someone for help, it's likely to make them think better of us. It's the flip side of the transformative effects of helping others. We can ask others to help us, which will help them feel better too. It's a pity then that most of us are bad at asking for help. We might need a crucial piece of information from a colleague, but instead of bothering them, we try to figure it out ourselves, wasting time in the process. Or we might be struggling with a particular problem in class, but find ourselves not wanting to ask for help from the person next to us, or even the teacher, for fear of looking stupid. So how can we learn to ask for help in a way that warms people to us rather than alienates them? Well, there are a few ways. First, we need to get over our reluctance to ask. The easiest way to do this is by simply adopting a maxim. People are more eager to help than you think. We have by now repeatedly seen how energizing it can be to make others smile, to teach, and to mentor. Even so, a lot of us underestimate how willing other people are to help us. According to the academics Francis Flynn and Vanessa Bonds, people tend to underestimate the likelihood that other people will agree to help us by up to 50%. Second, frame the request in the right way. In particular, do your best to ask for help in person. Asking virtually makes everything more difficult. In a 2017 study, Bonds found that, quote, help seekers assumed making a request via email would be equally as effective as making a request in person. In actuality, asking for help in person was approximately 34 times more effective. Finally, make sure you're using the right language. Avoid using negative phrases like, "I feel really bad for asking you this," and avoid turning it into a transaction by saying things like, "If you help me, I'll do this for you." Instead, emphasize the positive reasons for why you're going to that specific person for advice. For example, "I saw your work on X, Y, and Z, and it really had an impact on me. I would love to hear how you did A, B, and C." By emphasizing the positive aspects of the person you admire, they'll think you genuinely value their opinion and be more likely to help you. This last insight is key. When framed correctly, asking for help makes the person you're asking feel as good as the help makes you feel. If you want to harness the power of the Benjamin Franklin effect, you should do everything you can to ask without any sense of a quid pro quo. And finally, key idea number 3 for this chapter, over-communicate. When I first launched my business, the thing I struggled with most was the need for communication. To be precise, quite how much of it was necessary. I knew that sharing information was important, obviously. What I hadn't realized was how much I needed to communicate. I eventually realized, usually thanks to helpful pointers from my long-suffering team, that my fears about being too overbearing had made me not communicate enough. I wasn't giving the positive or negative feedback that most of my team members really wanted. This is a common phenomenon. We're much more likely to underestimate how much communication we need to do than overestimate it. So where most books about bringing people together focus on communication, here I want to focus on the power of over-communication. When you think you've communicated plenty, you almost certainly haven't. Different team members might interpret the shared information in different ways or have different levels of context or understanding. Over-communicating means deliberately going beyond the minimum you think is necessary, and consequently ending up sharing exactly the right amount. But how? Experiment number 5, over-communicate the good. A Swedish proverb says, "A shared joy is a double joy, a shared sorrow is a half sorrow." When one person shares good news with another, both people are happy. And when one person shares something sad with another, the act of sharing takes some of the sadness away. The first tactic for over-communicating the good, then, is to share positive news, and to react to positive news in an energizing way. This helps both the sharer and the responder. For the sharer, the simple act of sharing positive news increases positive emotions and psychological well-being. For the responder, expressing pride and happiness in the other person's accomplishments fuels a positive interaction and bolsters the relationship. In psychology, this form of self-reinforcing positive interaction is called capitalization. One paper on the subject characterizes capitalization as involving 2 components. The first part involves someone, the sharer, trying to connect with someone else through a positive event and the positive emotions associated with it. For example, you might go to a friend and say, "Hey, I finally got that salary raise I was looking for." In the second part, the good news recipient reacts in a positive way with enthusiasm and excitement. So they might say, "Oh wow, that's so great. I know you've been working really hard for that raise." Simple perhaps, but not necessarily straightforward. Because according to the University of California psychology professor Shelley Gable, there are myriad ways you can respond to good news, and not all of them are as positive. We can think of these as falling on 2 axes. First, whether your response is active or passive, and second, whether your response is constructive or destructive. Suppose your flatmate returns home one day and tells you that they've been offered a job that they've been working hard for. Here are how these 4 different responses would look like. Cheerleader Charlie. An active constructive response would be something like, "Wow, that's great. You've been working so hard for this, I knew you'd get it." Easygoing Emma. A passive constructive response would be some kind of understated response, like giving them a gentle nod and smiling, then saying, "That's good news." Envious Ethan. An active destructive response would be some kind of response that undermines your flatmate's success. For example, "Oh, does that mean you're going to be too busy to hang out in the evenings and on weekends then?" And finally, we have self-centered Sam. A passive destructive response would basically ignore your flatmate's good news. For example, "Well, you won't believe what happened to me today." And we have a diagram in the supplementary PDF that basically shows the axes from active to passive and from destructive to constructive, with Cheerleader Charlie, Easygoing Emma, Envious Ethan, and Self-Centered Sam with some cute little icons in the relevant places on the graph. Gable and her colleagues found that responding to good news in an active, constructive way makes the sharer of the good news happier and makes the relationship stronger. Indeed, in a 2006 study, researchers videotaped 79 couples who were dating to examine how they discussed good news and bad news with each other. It turns out that how participants responded to their partner's good news was the strongest predictor of how long they'd stay together and how happy they were in those relationships. So being able to celebrate people's wins matters, and the best way to do so is to adopt an active, constructive approach to all good news. Fortunately, this is something we can learn. The first step is to feel and show your delight and joy for the other person's good news. Try phrases like, "That's such wonderful news," and "I couldn't be happier for you." Next, recall to the sharer of good news how you've actively witnessed the process that led to the good news. Perhaps you've seen how hard they've worked to prepare for that job interview, the weeks they studied for the qualifying exam, how much they wanted that outcome. And above all, show your optimism for how this good news might shape their future without overburdening them with high expectations. If someone's just landed a dream job, share how excited you are for the opportunities ahead of them. If someone's just quit a mundane job to start their own business, share how excited you are for them about their future adventures. At every turn, try to make your overcommunication about the good as positive and as uplifting as possible. Overcommunication won't just inspire them, it will inspire you too. And finally, we come to experiment number 6, overcommunicate the not so good. In order to really harness the feel-good effects of other people, we don't just need to communicate good news though. We need to learn to communicate bad news too. Unfortunately, we're not always very good at that. The problem is that we humans are just too good at lying. It's not just that we lie every day, we lie every hour. According to a 2002 study conducted by University of Massachusetts psychologist Robert Feldman, 60% of people lie at least once in an average 10-minute conversation. Not all lies are created equal, of course. Most lies are trivial and told with good intentions, like telling a friend that you love his new trainers when they're not your style, or reassuring your mother that the roast chicken is absolutely not dry. But there's a downside. Lying, even lying with good intentions, has a physiological effect. Lying is associated with the activation of the limbic system, the same area of the brain that initiates the fight or flight response. When we're honest, this area of the brain shows minimal activity. When telling a lie, it lights up like a fireworks display. The reason for all this lying is that honesty often feels like a lose-lose situation. We lose if we're too honest because we come across like a jerk, but we also lose if we're not honest because we feel resentful about being stuck in a situation that we're not okay with. This is tricky for anyone who has adopted the maxim of overcommunication. We need to communicate the bad stuff without lying needlessly. Is there a way? According to author and CEO coach Kim Scott, the solution is not to be honest, but candid. In her book Radical Candor, Scott writes that being radically candid is about caring personally, that is, genuinely caring about the person you're speaking to, while also directly challenging the issue at hand. Being radically candid doesn't mean making the issue personal, it doesn't mean assuming you know best, and it doesn't mean saying whatever pops into your head. It does mean sharing your opinions directly, not talking badly about people behind their backs, and giving your co-workers insight into what's going on in your head. Choosing the word candid over honest has some benefits. Being honest implies that you know the truth. It often has a moral connotation to it that can put people off. The memory of my school friend James insulting my card tricks with a flippant, "I'm just being honest, mate," haunts me to this day. When we say, "Let me be honest with you," it's almost as if we're saying, "This is the truth and I'm going to tell you what it is." But when it comes to interpersonal dynamics, the truth is often unclear. Your line manager might feel like a drainer to you, but it might not be true that this person is an objectively bad manager. For all we know, they could be a good manager for other people, or maybe they're going through something in their personal lives that's affecting them at work. In contrast, being candid doesn't assume that we know the truth. The spirit of being candid is more like, "Here's what I think, can you hear me out or help me out? We can do it together." So how can we all learn to craft a culture of candid feedback, one that delivers negative feedback without ruining anyone's day? Well, there are a few steps to follow. First, root your analysis in objective, non-judgmental terms. For example, "I noticed you cut Hermione off a few times in that meeting" is much more effective than "you are incredibly rude." Similarly, telling people "you are wrong" or "you are incompetent" is going to make that person feel attacked and defensive. It's too subjective, not to mention a little rude too. Just stick to the facts. Second, focus on the tangible results of what's gone wrong. Again, subjectivity is your enemy, so simply highlight, factually, the consequence of what you observed. For example, I noticed that after you interrupted Ron in that meeting, the discussion died down a bit. That's a real shame because I would have really liked to hear what other people have to say. And finally, turn your attention away from the problem and towards the solution. Provide alternatives of what you'd like to see happen. For example, next time please wait until people have finished speaking before sharing your thoughts. Or next time maybe you could ask people questions to show that you're interested in their view but might not agree with them. I feel like asking questions might get a better reaction from them and maybe lead to a collaboration. Offering alternatives focuses the discussion on possible solutions to the problem and helps the other person avoid feeling personally criticized. These 3 steps are a simple way to make over-communication of unpleasant news a little easier. They all hint at the notion that it's possible to bring people together and make them feel good, even when you're delivering bad news, not a lie in sight. In summary, life is more fun with friends around. That's why our third energizer is people. There are some people who naturally uplift our energy. The trick is finding them. That starts with becoming a team player. Try treating the people you're working with as comrades rather than as competitors. Building connections with people is also about lending them a hand. This cuts both ways. Not only do we too rarely help others, we also too rarely ask for help. So try asking, what can I do to brighten someone else's day? Finally, remember the most oft-forgotten truth about human interaction. When you think you've communicated too much, you probably haven't communicated enough. Is there a piece of information you're hoarding that might just make someone else's week? Part 2. Unblock. Chapter 4. Seek clarity. One of the strangest videos I've ever seen is called How Bad Do You Want It? It's been viewed almost 50 million times. The video recounts the story of a young man who goes to an unspecified guru and asks for his advice on how to become rich. The next day, they agree to meet by a beach so the guru can explain the answer. At 4 a.m. the following morning, the man arrives at the seashore. Walk on out in the water, the guru tells him. The young man does. Walk a little further, says the guru. The man does. Keep walking, the guru says. He keeps walking until his head is fully submerged. Suddenly the guru is there by the young man, holding his head beneath the surface. The young man struggles violently, but the old man holds him down, only releasing him when he's on the verge of drowning. As the young man gasps for air, the old man says, "When you want to succeed as badly as you want to breathe, then you'll be successful." There's a lot going on in this video. Who actually is the guru, and how precisely does one get that job title? Why is the young man so willing to walk out into the sea at said guru's request? Haven't they just met? Most peculiarly of all, why are there 20,000 comments underneath the video in which people say it has completely changed their life? These days, I find the video both surreal and somewhat depressing. But the first time I watched, I was in the throes of a bout of debilitating procrastination, and I thought it might help. When I first launched my business while working as a junior doctor, it seemed like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break free from the cycle of putting things off and scrambling to catch up. I wasn't alone. Procrastination has plagued much greater minds than mine. Take Leonardo da Vinci. One contemporary who saw him painting The Last Supper wrote how, quote, he would go for 2, 3, or 4 days without touching his brush, but spending several hours a day in front of the work, his arms folded, examining and criticizing the figures to himself. In these moments, the 3 energizers, play, power, and people, aren't enough. In part 1, we explored how these 3 forces can help us feel good in our work and life, boosting our energy and helping us do more of what matters to us. But by themselves, they're not the whole story. As my business grew, I realized that however much I integrated the energizers into my life, I could still come unstuck because of another P, procrastination. When procrastination has been a problem for me, I've often been tempted to turn to obvious hacks, just like the one in that weird video. If you're procrastinating, the video says, it's because you're not motivated enough. And if you just had enough motivation, if only you wanted to succeed as badly as you wanted to breathe, it would happen. I call this solution to procrastination the motivation method. It's very common, and it's total nonsense. The trouble with the motivation method is very simple. There are plenty of us who genuinely do want to do the things we struggle with. We feel like we've got enough motivation, but there are barriers that get in our way. Time and financial constraints, family responsibilities, physical and mental health issues, among countless other things. Motivation clearly isn't enough, and telling people to simply feel more motivated isn't just unhelpful, it's potentially harmful, contributing to the sense of paralysis that caused procrastination in the first place. So when motivation fails, where do we turn? When not obsessing over whether you truly are motivated, much advice turns to another principle: discipline. Put simply, discipline is when we do stuff that we don't feel like doing. It's the opposite of motivation. It's taking action despite how unmotivated you are. If you're trying to go for a jog, a motivated response would be, I feel like going for a run because I want to win the marathon more than I want to rest today. A disciplined response would be, I'm going for a run regardless of how I feel about it. This is the Nike school of getting things done. Just do it. I'm a little more sympathetic to the discipline method than the motivation method. Discipline can be useful. Sometimes I don't feel like going to work in the morning, but I do it anyway. Maybe that's discipline. But this narrative is incomplete. If you're procrastinating from writing that speech you've got coming up, it might not necessarily be that you just aren't disciplined enough to prepare for it. There might be something else going on under the surface that's holding you back, and the discipline narrative doesn't care about what it is. It just makes you feel bad about yourself. In the words of psychology professor Joseph Ferrari, quote, to tell the chronic procrastinator to just do it would be like saying to a clinically depressed person, cheer up. Motivation and discipline are useful strategies, but they're band-aids covering up deeper wounds. They might sometimes work to treat the symptoms, but they don't change the underlying condition. So what does work in the age-old fight against procrastination? That's where our third approach comes in. I call it the unblock method. While the motivation method advised us to make ourselves feel like doing the thing, and the discipline method advised us to ignore how we feel and do it anyway, the unblock method encourages us to understand why we're feeling bad about work in the first place and tackle the issue head on. Imagine you've got a pebble in your shoe that makes running particularly painful, but you have to run over to your friend's house in time for dinner. You're torn. You want to arrive on time, but you know that embarking on the journey is going to hurt. What do? The first solution is the easiest. Do nothing. Procrastinate until the evening has been wasted, miss your dinner, and don't get invited next time. The next solution draws upon the motivation method. That would involve convincing yourself that the dinner is going to be exciting and worth the pain of running. You ignore the pain as you race towards your destination, only to collapse on the side of the road halfway there. But you're not worried as you look down at your quickly swelling foot. When you're sufficiently motivated, you'll be able to overcome any obstacle after all. The third solution is the discipline method. You've committed to the dinner and you're the sort of person who keeps their word. So you run to your friend's house, the pebble breaking the delicate skin of your soul, and lo and behold, you make it. Unfortunately, the dinner can't go ahead because your friend has to drive you and your bloody stump to the hospital. Discipline is freedom, you recite to yourself as you await medical attention. I would tentatively suggest that all three solutions are off the mark. The fourth and best solution involves a little more critical thinking. What if you took a minute to think, why does getting to my friend's house seem so hard? You would take your shoe off, find the pebble and remove it, and then off you'd run. This is the unblock method, and it's the focus of the next 3 chapters. We'll learn that usually procrastination is caused by negative feelings, the inverse of the feel-good energizers we encountered in part 1. When negative feelings like confusion, fear, and inertia stand in our way, we put things off. This leads to even more bad feelings, and in turn, even more procrastination. It's a negative loop of low mood and stagnation. And here in the supplementary PDF, you will find a lovely little diagram where essentially it describes the motivation method, which is the question of how do I make myself want it? That goes into the discipline method, which is how do I push through it? And ultimately we land on the unblock method, which is where we ask the question, what's blocking me from doing it? Fortunately, the power of all 3 emotional blockers can be reduced. In the chapters that follow, we'll explore how precisely these negative feelings affect us and sap our energy, and we'll use the science of feel-good productivity to strategically overcome each of them. The fog of uncertainty. The first blocker to feel-good productivity is the simplest, but it's also one of the hardest to notice. It's so common that we don't even realize it's there. Picture yourself driving on a foggy evening. You're squinting to see the road ahead. You try to make the front lights even brighter, but the fog just isn't clearing. Eventually you realize you need to pull over as the fog is debilitating. This is a little like the sensation of procrastination. Often, the reason we don't make a start is because we don't know what we're supposed to be doing in the first place. a mystifying fog has set in around us. I call it the fog of uncertainty. This is a well-studied phenomenon, one that scientists call uncertainty paralysis. It happens when we become overwhelmed by the unknowns or the complexity of a situation, leading to an inability to act. This paralysis prevents us from making progress on tasks, projects, or decisions. It gets in the way of feeling good and gets in the way of getting things done. Uncertainty makes us feel bad and so achieve less. Humans have an innate aversion to what we don't know. We naturally prefer predictability and stability, which is what allows us to be decisive and effective. But at the same time, some of us are better at dealing with uncertainty than others. Psychologists and psychiatrists measure this using something called the Intolerance of Uncertainty Inventory, abbreviated IUI. Developed by Michel Dugas and his colleagues in the 1990s, the inventory consists of a series of statements that express tolerance of uncertainty. One statement reads, "Not knowing what will happen in advance is often unacceptable for me," for example. To measure how tolerant to uncertainty you are, psychologists look at the extent to which you agree with each statement and aggregate your responses to create an overall score. The IUI offers the first hint as to how and why uncertainty drives procrastination. People with a low tolerance of uncertainty tend to view uncertain situations as threatening and anxiety-provoking, leading them to put things off, particularly on tasks involving any ambiguity. Why? Well, according to a review on the relationship between anxiety and uncertainty, there are a handful of processes that reinforce the loop between uncertainty, anxiety, and paralysis. 1. We overestimate what's at stake. Someone who's already anxious will think that the uncertain event is going to be worse than it already is. 2. We become hyper-vigilant. Sensing that something negative might happen, our safety antennae prick up to the sign of any potential danger. 3. We stop recognizing safety cues. Because we're hyper-vigilant to threats, we're not able to calm down when there really is no danger. And 4. We become avoidant. Our brains encourage us to adopt behavioral and cognitive avoidance strategies to get us out of there as soon as possible. Anyone who has ever procrastinated will recognize at least some of these factors. Consider a common source of uncertainty, like choosing a career path. Suppose you're in a stable job, but you're contemplating quitting for a less stable but potentially more fulfilling career. The uncertainty surrounding the less stable path might set off this process as follows. 1. Overestimation. You overestimate the negative consequences of choosing the wrong career path, like not making enough money. 2. Hypervigilance. You become overly attentive to signs that could indicate the success or failure of a particular career choice, like statistics that suggest that lots of people regret changing jobs. 3. Unrecognition. You stop identifying the factors that would contribute to a successful outcome, like doing research on the company you're considering joining. And 4. Avoidance. You decide to put off making this career decision completely. After all, it can't be that bad sticking it out for another year in your current job. The result? You experience heightened emotional reactions such as anxiety or fear, and that makes you procrastinate from making a career decision for even longer. You feel worse, and so you do less. Most of us have experienced struggles of this kind. But the good news is that the cycle can be broken and the fog of uncertainty eliminated. It's a simple matter of asking a few well-placed questions. Once they're answered, the road ahead becomes much clearer. Key idea number 1, ask why. The main way uncertainty drives procrastination is by creating ambiguity over our ultimate purpose. If we don't know why we're embarking on any given project, it's near impossible to get on with actually doing it. This, at least, is the conclusion that the US Army came to in 1982, the year the US Army published an updated version of their official field manual, FM 100-5, Operations. The military's main How to Fight guide, the FM outlined to officials the methods most likely to bring them success on the battlefield. At its heart was a new concept, commander's intent. Commander's intent is rooted in the German military tradition, dating back to the Prussian army of the late 19th century. German military strategists realized that no battle plan could ever predict the chaotic realities of war. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. As Field Marshal Moltke the Elder put it, actually, to be precise, he said, no plan of operations extends with certainty beyond the first encounter with the enemy's main strength, but that's not as catchy. So instead of obsessing over every step their soldiers might take on the battlefield, German officers embraced the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, a philosophy that prioritized a clear sense of why over an excessively detailed sense of how. Commander's intent, as outlined in the field manual, consists of 3 crucial components, all built around the basic point of the mission. 1. The purpose behind the operation. 2. The end state that the commander was aiming for. And 3. The key tasks that the commander felt should be taken to accomplish the objective. Commander's intent suggested that the goal of generals is to answer only the highest level why questions, identifying the purpose behind the operation and, at a push, vaguely sketching out the sort of stages that might be necessary. The troops were then given the flexibility to adapt their decisions to the changing circumstances of the front.